My fiancée did not want me to meet her parents and said they would not be at our wedding. So I secretly went to see them and was horrified by what I found. My name is Lawrence. I am 69 years old and a retired structural engineer. I spent 4 decades building skyscrapers across this country, calculating the breaking point of steel and concrete. I survived the cutthroat construction industry by learning to read the microscopic cracks in a foundation before the whole building collapsed. Last Tuesday, the foundation of my life fractured. Valerie, my 48-year-old fiancée, stood in my kitchen and demanded we cancel our planned ceremony. She insisted we get married at the courthouse by Friday, just the 2 of us. No guests, no family. I asked her about her parents, Thomas and Martha. I told her a wedding without family felt hollow. Valerie burst into tears. She buried her face in her hands and spun a tragic story. She claimed her parents were violent racists. She said they disowned her the moment they found out she was marrying a black man. She described their hatred in vivid, sickening detail, warning me they would ruin the day if they even knew about it. But I did not look at her tears. I looked at her hands. Her fingers gripped the edge of the granite countertop so hard her knuckles turned white. They were trembling violently. I had spent 40 years reading people in high-stakes boardroom negotiations. Her tremor did not come from sorrow or shame. It came from raw, unadulterated panic. She was terrified of something, and it had nothing to do with race. I pulled her close, whispered that everything would be fine, and agreed to the courthouse wedding. The lie was planted. Now I needed to find out why. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to trust your gut when someone you loved looked you in the eye and lied. The morning after our conversation, Valerie shifted her routine. For the past year, I had managed my own morning heart medication, a strict regimen prescribed after a mild scare 2 years ago. Suddenly, Valerie took over. She brought me a glass of water and a small ceramic bowl holding unfamiliar capsules. She claimed they were holistic supplements sourced from an exclusive wellness clinic. She smiled warmly, her hand resting on my shoulder, insisting they would give me more energy for our upcoming honeymoon. I swallowed them without a word. Valerie kissed my cheek and went upstairs to get dressed. 3 hours later, a heavy, dull ache bloomed in the center of my chest. It was not a sharp pain, but a steady, unnatural tightening. My breath grew shallow as I sat in my home office. I pressed 2 fingers to my pulse. The rhythm was erratic, skipping beats in a way it never had before. As a structural engineer, my entire career relied on identifying stress points. I knew exactly how a building behaved right before a critical, load-bearing pillar gave way. The vibrations change. The internal pressure builds silently until catastrophic failure occurs. I was feeling that exact physical change inside my own body. The foundation was failing, and Valerie was the one swinging the sledgehammer. I did not panic. I simply sat there, letting the cold reality wash over me. She was adjusting my internal chemistry. The woman claiming to protect me from her racist parents was actively compromising my heart. I needed tangible proof. I needed to see the blueprints of her deception. Valerie left the house at noon for a bridal dress fitting. The moment her luxury sedan pulled out of the driveway, I went straight to her private study. I did not tear the room apart. Amateurs leave a mess. I conducted a systematic sweep. I checked the drawers, the filing cabinets, and the bookshelves. Everything was perfectly organized, almost sterile. Then I looked at the woven trash bin beside her mahogany desk. It was empty except for a single crumpled piece of paper tossed carelessly at the bottom. I reached in and smoothed it out on the desk. It was a bank transfer receipt from her personal checking account. The transaction had cleared exactly 24 hours ago. It showed a massive wire transfer of $12,000. The recipient was an entity called Oakwood Sanctuary. A quick search on my computer revealed Oakwood Sanctuary was not a charity or a wellness retreat. It was an elite, high-security assisted living facility located 3 hours north, buried deep in the rural mountains. The facility specialized in locking down patients with severe, violent dementia. It was a fortress designed to keep people in and keep the world out. The $12,000 was a monthly recurring payment. Valerie, who claimed her parents had completely disowned her and severed all ties, was quietly spending a fortune every single month to keep an account active at a remote psychiatric lockdown facility. She had lied about the racism. She had lied about the estrangement. She was hiding someone behind a $12,000 wall, and she was terrified I would find out. I folded the bank receipt and slid it into my wallet. The tightness in my chest pulsed, a stark reminder of the fake supplements dissolving in my stomach. I walked into the kitchen and found the ceramic bowl where Valerie kept her holistic pills. I poured the entire batch down the garbage disposal and turned on the hot water, washing away the poison. I did not call her to demand an explanation. Confronting a liar without a complete set of facts only gives them the opportunity to build a better lie. I needed to inspect the site myself. I grabbed my heavy jacket and the keys to my old reliable truck. I left my primary cell phone on the kitchen counter to ensure she could not track my location through any shared applications. I grabbed a prepaid emergency phone from my safe. I locked the front door and got into my truck. The engine roared to life. I pulled out of the driveway and headed north toward the mountains. The sky grew gray and heavy as the city skyline faded in my rearview mirror. I drove for 3 hours through winding, desolate roads, my mind calculating every angle of Valerie's deception. The woman I intended to marry on Friday was slowly stopping my heart while financing a secret prison in the woods. I was no longer a fiancé preparing for a wedding. I was an engineer investigating a compromised structure, ready to tear down the drywall and expose the rot hiding behind the fresh paint. The conflict had shifted from quiet suspicion to active infiltration. Oakwood Sanctuary loomed ahead, waiting to reveal its secrets. The drive north ended at an iron gate. Oakwood Sanctuary sat surrounded by dense pine trees and high concrete walls. This was no luxury wellness retreat. It looked exactly like the maximum security correctional facilities I used to design ventilation systems for in the late 80s. I parked my truck out of sight from the main entrance cameras. I grabbed my old titanium clipboard and clipped my faded corporate engineering badge to my heavy canvas jacket. I walked through the double reinforced glass doors with the heavy, unyielding stride of a man who owned the building. A security guard stepped forward. His hand rested on his radio. I did not give him a chance to speak. I shoved the clipboard against his chest. I told him a catastrophic pressure failure in the primary HVAC system was about to pump carbon monoxide into the south wing. I demanded immediate access to the structural corridors. 40 years of commanding construction sites taught me that people do not question a man who speaks in absolutes and engineering terminology. The guard panicked. He buzzed me through the heavy steel security doors without logging my name. I walked past the sterile reception desk and headed straight for the restricted patient wing. The air smelled of industrial bleach and suppressed despair. There were no nurses chatting in the hallways. Heavy electronic locks secured every single door. I read the numbers on the walls, counting down the hallway until I reached the end of the corridor. Room 314. The digital keypad flashed red. I pulled a master override keycard from my wallet. I had retained it from a security retrofit project decades ago. I swiped the card. The light turned green. The heavy door clicked open. I pushed the door wide. The room was utterly barren. There were no paintings on the walls. There were no personal belongings. Just 2 iron-framed beds and a single bolted table. Thomas and Martha sat rigidly on the edge of the mattress. They wore thin hospital gowns. Their skin was pale and their eyes were hollowed out by heavy chemical sedation. They looked nothing like the violent, wealthy racists Valerie had vividly described. They looked like prisoners of war awaiting execution. The moment I stepped into the room, Martha flinched. She threw her arms over her head in a defensive posture. Thomas stood up. His knees shook violently. He tried to position his frail body in front of his wife. I raised my hands slowly to show I meant no harm. I stated my name. I told them I was engaged to Valerie. The reaction was instantaneous. Thomas did not hurl racial slurs. He did not curse my presence. He fell to his knees on the cold linoleum floor and wept. He reached out with trembling, bruised hands and grabbed the fabric of my jeans. Martha covered her mouth and sobbed uncontrollably. The sheer magnitude of their terror hit me with physical force. I locked the door behind me and knelt beside Thomas. I helped the old man back onto his bed. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He looked at my face with absolute desperate clarity. He begged me to listen. He begged me to believe him. The foundation of Valerie's lies began to crumble instantly under the weight of their genuine agony. Thomas grabbed my forearm. His grip possessed a desperate, terrifying strength. He told me Valerie was a monster. He explained she had never worked as an art appraiser a single day in her life. 2 years ago, she arrived at their generational estate with a private lawyer. She presented a forged medical power of attorney. The document declared both Thomas and Martha legally incompetent due to advanced violent dementia. They had no mental decline. They were perfectly healthy. But Valerie had bribed a private physician to sign the evaluation. Before they could hire legal defense, she hired private security to forcibly remove them from their home in the dead of night. She dropped them in this high-security lockdown ward. She instructed the staff to keep them heavily sedated, claiming they were a danger to themselves and others. She liquidated their bank accounts. She sold their ancestral home to a commercial developer. She drained every cent of their retirement funds to finance her high-society lifestyle in the city. Martha leaned forward. Her voice was raspy from disuse and dehydration. She told me the staff here ignored their pleas. The forged documents gave Valerie absolute control over their communication, their medical care, and their visitors. They were erased from the world. No one was coming to look for them. I processed the information with cold mechanical precision. Valerie had executed a flawless hostile takeover of her own parents' lives. She had isolated them, stripped their assets, and buried them alive. I realized the same trap was being constructed around me. The holistic supplements, the rushed courthouse wedding. She was preparing my financial execution. Martha slid off the bed. She knelt on the floor and pulled off her standard-issue hospital slipper. She reached under the cheap foam insole and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. She handed it to me. My hands felt completely steady as I unfolded it. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed and frayed at the edges. The photograph showed Valerie wearing a black mourning dress. She was standing next to a large mahogany casket. A handsome older man smiled in a framed picture resting above the grave. The headline read that local contractor William Hastings had passed away suddenly at the age of 65. I looked at Martha. She stared directly into my eyes. She warned me to run away. She told me William was Valerie's first husband. He was a wealthy independent contractor with a massive portfolio. Martha explained that William was perfectly healthy until Valerie moved into his home. Then his health declined rapidly. The local coroner ruled it a sudden myocardial infarction. Heart failure. Valerie inherited his entire business, liquidated his assets within a month, and vanished. I looked at the photograph again. The tightness in my chest from Valerie's morning supplements pulsed like a warning siren. The pattern was identical. She targeted older, wealthy men with no immediate family close by. She isolated them. She broke down their cardiovascular systems while quietly seizing legal control of their estates. I folded the newspaper clipping and placed it in my pocket. I did not panic. I did not show fear. I looked at Thomas and Martha. I promised them I would return with an extraction team. I unlocked the door, stepped back into the sterile hallway, and began calculating the exact demolition of the woman who intended to murder me. I drove south down the mountain pass in absolute silence. The radio remained off. My mind functioned like a drafting compass, drawing precise lines between the variables of my life over the past 6 months. Arthur died of a sudden myocardial infarction. Heart failure. A man who, according to Martha, possessed perfect cardiovascular health until Valerie moved into his home. I pressed my palm against my own chest. The dull, unnatural tightness from this morning throbbed beneath my ribs. It was not indigestion. It was not stress. It was a calculated chemical demolition. Valerie insisted on managing my daily health regimen exactly 4 months ago. She replaced my prescribed beta blockers with an amber glass bottle of holistic supplements. She claimed they contained rare antioxidants to build my stamina. I swallowed them blindly, trusting the woman who slept beside me. I spent my entire career calculating the load-bearing capacity of steel beams and concrete pillars. I knew how to identify structural fatigue. A building does not collapse instantly. It groans. The microfractures spread through the foundation long before the walls cave in. Valerie applied the exact same methodology to my cardiovascular system. She was introducing a foreign agent, slowly weakening the muscle tissue to guarantee a fatal collapse that would look entirely natural to a coroner. The timeline aligned perfectly. She needed my heart to stop right after the courthouse wedding on Friday, activating the forged legal directives she possessed. I gripped the steering wheel hard enough to turn my knuckles gray. Anger is a useless emotion in a crisis. Anger makes you sloppy. I needed clinical, ruthless precision. I needed raw data. I needed to isolate the variables and dismantle her operation piece by piece before she triggered the final implosion. I pulled into a brightly lit gas station on the outskirts of the city. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I walked to the edge of the parking lot, standing in the cold evening air to ensure absolute privacy. I pulled the secure prepaid phone from my jacket pocket and dialed Gavin. Gavin owned the most elite private intelligence firm on the eastern seaboard. 10 years ago, he was a brilliant but bankrupt investigator facing corporate ruin. I reviewed his business model, recognized his absolute competence, and handed him a blank check to rebuild his agency. He never forgot the investment. Loyalty in my circle is an unbreakable currency. Gavin answered on the first ring. I bypassed the standard greetings. I told him I needed a comprehensive, unauthorized background extraction on a man named Arthur. I provided the exact last name from the newspaper clipping Martha gave me. I instructed Gavin to acquire the original police report, the coroner's initial findings, and the final death certificate. I needed to know exactly who signed the cremation order and how quickly the assets were liquidated. Gavin did not ask why. He did not question the sudden urgency. He recognized the cold command in my voice. He promised to rip into the county archives and have a preliminary dossier ready before midnight. I hung up the phone and tossed it into the passenger seat of my truck. The digital trail was in motion. Gavin would find the cracks in her past. I needed to handle the immediate present. I bought a bottle of cold water, rinsed the bitter taste of the morning's poison from my mouth, and drove the remaining 20 miles to my estate. The real performance was about to begin. I parked my truck in the driveway. The house was fully illuminated, projecting a false image of domestic warmth. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Valerie stood in the foyer. She wore a pristine white silk robe, projecting an aura of absolute innocence. Her smile was wide and perfectly engineered. She held a steaming ceramic mug of chamomile tea in her left hand. In her right hand, she held a small glass dish containing 2 of the amber capsules. She told me I looked exhausted from my commercial site inspection. She insisted I take my evening supplements immediately to keep my blood pressure stable. I looked at the pills. They were identical to the ones that caused my chest to ache this morning. I looked at her face. Her eyes were sharp, scanning my posture for any sign of weakness or suspicion. I gave her nothing. I smiled and thanked her for her dedication to my health. I reached out and took the glass dish. I picked up the 2 capsules. Valerie did not break eye contact. She stepped closer, handing me the mug of hot tea. She stood merely inches away, waiting. She needed visual confirmation, a predator watching her prey step into the fatal trap. I raised my hand to my mouth. I placed the capsules against my lips, but I executed a swift sleight of hand. I pushed the pills into the gap between my thumb and index finger, pressing the empty palm against my mouth. I took the heavy mug and drank a deep swallow of the hot tea. I forced a convincing, loud swallow, rubbing my throat for effect. Valerie exhaled heavily. The manufactured tension in her shoulders vanished instantly. Her smile reached her eyes this time, fueled by the satisfaction of a successful administration. She took the empty glass dish from my hand. She told me she was going upstairs to draw a warm bath for us. She turned her back and walked up the grand staircase. I watched her ascend, my face devoid of all emotion. I waited until I heard the bathroom door click shut and the heavy rush of water filling the tub. I walked directly into my private home office and locked the heavy oak door. I opened my clenched fist. The 2 amber capsules rested in my palm. My chest throbbed lightly, a lingering echo from the morning dose, reminding me of the lethal stakes. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a small, clear plastic evidence bag I used for storing microscopic construction components. I dropped the 2 capsules inside and sealed the zipper tight. I held the bag up to the desk lamp. The powder inside looked completely benign, a masterpiece of chemical camouflage. Valerie thought she was accelerating my demise. She believed she controlled the timeline of my life. Instead, she had just handed me the exact mechanism of her own destruction. I placed the plastic bag securely into the inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. I had the physical murder weapon. Now I needed the irrefutable chemical breakdown to weaponize it legally. I needed to know the exact composition of the toxin she was feeding me. I unlocked my office door and walked toward the staircase. Every step I took felt calculated and heavy. I was ready to play the role of the dying fiancée for one more night, gathering the intelligence required to bury her. The digital clock on my dashboard shifted to exactly midnight as my truck descended into the subterranean levels of the corporate parking garage. The concrete structure was a fortress of shadow and silence. I parked in the designated security bay on the lowest subterranean level. A sleek black sedan idled 2 spaces away. The headlights flashed once. Gavin stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward me. His posture was rigid, exuding the disciplined awareness of a man who traded in high-stakes corporate espionage. 10 years ago, Gavin was a brilliant tactical investigator drowning in insurmountable agency debt. I saw his potential and wrote a blank check to salvage his firm. He repaid that investment with absolute, uncompromising loyalty. I rolled down my window. I did not offer a greeting. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my canvas jacket and retrieved the sealed plastic evidence bag containing the 2 amber capsules. I handed the bag to Gavin through the open window. I instructed him to run a complete expedited toxicology screen. I needed to know the exact chemical composition, the dosage threshold, and the precise biological effect these pills would trigger in a human cardiovascular system. Gavin held the bag up to the dim, overhead fluorescent light. He examined the powder inside with a critical, calculating eye. He recognized the severity of the request immediately. He promised to wake up his top chemical analyst and secure a preliminary laboratory breakdown within hours. I told him time was the one resource we no longer controlled. Gavin nodded, slipping the evidence bag securely into his coat pocket. The transaction was complete. But Gavin did not return to his car immediately. He reached into his vehicle and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila folder. Gavin handed me the heavy manila folder through the window. He stated it was the preliminary background extraction on Arthur Hastings. The data inside painted a terrifyingly efficient portrait of a predator. I opened the file under the faint glow of the dome light. Arthur died exactly 3 years and 2 months ago. The local police department closed the investigation within 48 hours. The official coroner report listed the cause of death as a sudden massive myocardial infarction. Natural causes. Arthur was 65 years old, wealthy, and entirely isolated from his extended family. The parallels to my own current existence were undeniable and chilling. Gavin leaned against my truck door and provided the verbal summary. Valerie had executed a flawless financial sweep. She produced a recently modified will granting her total control over Arthur's contracting firm and his liquid assets. She bypassed the standard mourning period entirely. She liquidated the commercial properties in less than 4 weeks, routing the funds through a maze of offshore holding companies. I flipped to the final page of the medical examiner report. The most glaring piece of evidence stared back at me. There was no autopsy. Valerie utilized her legal standing as the grieving widow to block any post-mortem physical examination. She ordered an immediate cremation. She reduced Arthur to ash before anyone could question the sudden nature of his heart failure. She incinerated the evidence. I closed the folder. The strategy was brutally effective. She isolated the target, compromised the heart, secured the legal paperwork, and destroyed the biological evidence. Valerie left absolutely no loose ends. I thanked Gavin for the intel. He stepped back from the truck, promising to call the moment the toxicology results verified my suspicions. I drove out of the dark garage. I returned to my estate and slipped back into bed without making a single sound. Valerie lay completely still on her side of the mattress. Her breathing was deep and rhythmic. She slept with the unbothered peace of a woman who believed she controlled the entire board. I lay awake in the dark, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. I listened to the quiet ticking of the hallway clock. 4 hours passed in agonizing silence. Exactly at 4 in the morning, my secured prepaid phone vibrated against my thigh. I slid out from under the heavy quilt, stepped out onto the cold hardwood floor, and walked silently into my master bathroom. I locked the solid oak door and answered the call. Gavin spoke in a low, tight voice. The laboratory analysis was complete and entirely conclusive. The amber capsules did not contain holistic antioxidants or wellness supplements. The pills contained concentrated lethal doses of digitalis. Gavin explained the chemical mechanics with cold, unforgiving precision. Digitalis is a potent cardiac glycoside derived from foxglove plants. In microscopic, medically prescribed doses, it treats heart failure. In the massive unprescribed doses Valerie was feeding me, it forcefully increased the intensity of the heart muscle contractions while dangerously slowing the electrical conduction. She was intentionally overloading my cardiovascular system. She was actively inducing a fatal cardiac arrest. Gavin warned that continuous ingestion would guarantee a catastrophic and entirely untraceable heart attack within days. I ended the call and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The reality settled into my bones like freezing water. The woman sleeping peacefully in the next room was a calculating murderer. She was methodically preparing my execution, hiding the deadly poison in a gesture of fake domestic affection. My initial instinct was primal and immediate. I wanted to call the local authorities, hand over the laboratory results, and watch the police drag her out of my house in handcuffs. But my structural engineering discipline overrode my rising anger. I analyzed the tactical environment. Calling the police right now was a fatal miscalculation. Valerie was a master of legal manipulation. If I alerted the authorities and triggered a sudden confrontation, the massive stress could induce the very heart attack she had been prepping my body for. If I suffered a major cardiac event and fell into a coma, the authorities would immediately look to my next of kin. Valerie had undoubtedly forged a comprehensive medical proxy just as she had done with her parents. She would gain absolute legal authority over my medical care and my corporate estate. She could simply order the hospital staff to pull the plug, inherit my entire empire, and claim the stress of the police investigation killed me. Arresting her was not enough. I had to completely dismantle her legal and financial infrastructure before I exposed the murder plot. I needed to build an impenetrable defense around my assets. She believed she was playing a simple game of domestic deception. She did not realize she had engaged an engineer who spent 40 years anticipating catastrophic failures and building absolute fail-safes into massive structures. I washed my face with freezing cold water. I unlocked the bathroom door and walked back into the bedroom. I looked at Valerie's sleeping form one last time. The rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. I would not be her second victim. I walked softly down the stairs to my home office. The silent financial war had officially begun. The sky over the city remained the color of bruised iron when I pulled my truck into the subterranean garage of the Sterling corporate tower. The underground facility was completely deserted at 5 in the morning. I walked into the private executive elevator and rode it to the 42nd floor. Bradley stood waiting in his corner office with a mug of black coffee in his hand. He had been my lead corporate attorney for 3 decades. Bradley was a legal architect who specialized in building impenetrable fortresses around massive financial empires. We survived hostile corporate takeovers, ruthless boardroom coups, and aggressive federal audits together. Loyalty was the foundation of our entire partnership. I sat across from his massive mahogany desk and placed the sealed plastic evidence bag on the polished wood. I told him exactly what was happening without a single trace of emotion. I detailed the forged medical documents locking Thomas and Martha inside Oakwood Sanctuary. I explained the fatal digitalis laced inside the holistic capsules Valerie fed me every morning. I outlined the sudden and entirely unexamined death of her first husband. Bradley did not interrupt me once. He listened with the cold, calculating precision of a man who dealt exclusively in facts and consequences. He stared at the plastic bag containing the lethal dose of heart medication. His expression remained completely neutral, but the grip on his coffee mug tightened until his knuckles turned white. Bradley understood the gravity of the situation immediately. This was no longer a simple matter of domestic betrayal. It was a calculated assassination attempt designed to seize total control of my life's work. I told Bradley we needed to launch a massive preemptive strike before she realized I knew the truth. I instructed Bradley to dismantle my entire visible financial footprint. I ordered the immediate construction of an impenetrable biometric blind trust. This was a legal structure we had conceptualized years ago to shield assets from extreme corporate warfare. Every single property stock portfolio, offshore investment, and liquid bank account had to be transferred out of my personal name. The assets would be legally absorbed by a newly formed corporate shell company. Access to this shell required my specific biometric verification to authorize any withdrawals or liquidations. If I were to die suddenly or fall into a medically induced coma, the entire trust would lock down automatically. A forged medical proxy or a coerced signature on a will would be completely useless against it. Bradley typed furiously on his secure laptop, drafting the initial framework of the corporate entity. He explained that establishing a trust of this magnitude usually took weeks of careful legal maneuvering. I told him he had exactly 48 hours to execute the complete transfer. Valerie believed she was days away from securing my fortune. I needed to ensure she inherited absolutely nothing but a hollow legal shell. She would gain control of a ghost estate. Every document she forged and every plan she orchestrated relied on my personal accounts remaining accessible. By moving my wealth behind a biometric wall, I stripped away her entire motive. Bradley printed the authorization forms. I signed my name repeatedly, shifting millions of dollars out of the reach of a murderer. We worked in absolute silence as the morning sun finally broke over the city skyline. I was legally dead on paper, financially erased from the public record, leaving Valerie to fight a war she had already lost without even knowing it. Bradley initiated a comprehensive sweep of all real estate holdings currently tied to my name. He utilized a proprietary corporate database to track any unauthorized inquiries or quiet background movements involving my properties. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city wake up while the program scanned county records. 10 minutes later, Bradley stopped typing. He let out a sharp breath and motioned for me to look at his monitor. He had uncovered a highly secured pending real estate listing. It was my primary residence. The house where I was currently sleeping next to Valerie was already under contract to be sold. Bradley pulled up the digital escrow documents. Valerie had bypassed my security measures and secretly forged my signature on a complete transfer of deed. She was selling my estate to an anonymous offshore buyer utilizing a shell company registered in a tax haven. The sale was completely hidden from the open market. She had arranged the transaction through a network of corrupt private brokers. I stared at my own forged signature on the screen. The handwriting was a flawless imitation. It was a masterclass in criminal deception. She was liquidating my life right from under my feet. Bradley explained the transaction was locked in escrow and only required a final verification signature to clear the funds. Valerie was planning to sell the roof over my head and wire the massive cash payout directly into her own untraceable accounts. Her greed was staggering in its efficiency. She did not just want my bank accounts, she wanted to convert every brick and concrete pillar I owned into untraceable offshore cash. I told Bradley to leave the fraudulent listing active so we could watch her criminal network operate in real time. Bradley highlighted the final closing date on the forged escrow contract. The date jumped off the screen like a warning flare. The offshore transfer was scheduled to execute on the exact day of our upcoming Friday courthouse wedding. The timeline snapped into perfect, horrifying focus. Valerie intended to marry me in the morning to establish her immediate legal standing as my wife. She would then trigger the massive real estate sale in the afternoon. The digitalis she was feeding me every morning would reach a critical, fatal mass by Friday night. It would stop my heart just as the offshore funds completely cleared her private accounts. She would become a grieving widow with millions of dollars safely laundered across the globe. I felt a sudden surge of cold, tactical clarity. I could not simply stop the transaction. Stopping it would only cause her to scatter and regroup her forces. I needed to trap her entire network of accomplices in one single swift motion. I looked at Bradley and gave him my final order for the morning. I instructed him to draft a flawlessly convincing fake deed transfer. I wanted a document that looked perfectly legitimate to her corrupt brokers, but contained deliberate structural flaws that rendered it absolutely worthless in any real court of law. I decided I would play the role of the frail dying victim perfectly. I would let her believe her plan was succeeding without a single hitch. I would walk straight into her trap and let her spring it. I told Bradley to alert federal fraud investigators and have them monitor the specific routing numbers attached to her escrow account. Valerie thought she was orchestrating the perfect silent adjustment. She was entirely unaware I had just rewritten the blueprints of her destruction. I left Bradley's office as the city fully awakened my financial ghost protocol firmly in place. I drove straight to Gavin's unmarked surveillance hub on the industrial side of the harbor. Gavin did not sleep. He operated on black coffee and raw data. He pulled up a complex digital matrix on his main monitor the moment I walked through the heavy steel door. He had tracked down the missing variable in Arthur's timeline. Arthur had a younger sister named Eleanor living entirely off the grid in rural Montana. Valerie had successfully and legally isolated Arthur from Eleanor during the last 2 years of his life. She filtered all communication and fabricated a bitter estrangement. Gavin handed me a printed transcript of a deep background check. Eleanor never believed her brother died of natural causes. She filed 3 separate police reports immediately following his sudden death demanding a full autopsy. Valerie used her status as the grieving, wealthy widow to have the local precinct dismiss Eleanor as a hysterical sibling hunting for a payout. Valerie sealed the estate before Eleanor could afford any legal representation. I instructed Gavin to establish a secure, encrypted line to Montana immediately. I spoke to Eleanor directly. I did not offer empty condolences or gentle introductions. I presented the cold facts. I told her about the digitalis Valerie was currently feeding me. I explained the exact methodology Valerie used to simulate sudden heart failure. The line went dead silent for 10 agonizing seconds. Then Eleanor spoke with a voice forged in pure glacial rage. She said she was ready to tear Valerie apart. I told Eleanor she would not need to lift a finger. I just needed her legal standing as a blood relative to bypass Valerie's perimeter. The alliance was forged instantly between us today. I routed a massive, untraceable wire transfer to Bradley's legal war chest. I authorized him to launch an overwhelming offensive on behalf of Eleanor. Bradley deployed his most aggressive litigators across state lines. They hit the county courthouse with a tactical barrage of emergency injunctions. They moved with absolute speed to seize Arthur's original medical records from the compromised local physician. The primary objective was a court-ordered exhumation of Arthur's remains. We needed to test his tissue for retained traces of digitalis to prove historical murder. Gavin intercepted the original funeral home receipts during the initial document seizure. He discovered a massive discrepancy in Valerie's timeline. Valerie had repeatedly claimed she cremated Arthur immediately to honor his final wishes and scattered his ashes in the ocean. The paperwork revealed the brutal truth. Cremation required specific legal waiting periods and additional medical examiner sign-offs in that jurisdiction. Valerie was in a desperate rush to liquidate the estate and secure her newly inherited wealth. She refused to pay the expedited cremation fees or wait for the extra paperwork to clear. To save a few $1,000s and accelerate her payout, she ordered the cheapest closed casket burial available in a forgotten municipal cemetery. Her own relentless greed had preserved the murder weapon. She buried the physical evidence deep in the dirt instead of burning it to ash. Bradley filed the exhumation request directly with the district judge under the seal of an active homicide investigation. He cited the newly discovered digitalis toxicity in my blood as parallel evidence of a serial poisoning methodology. The legal machinery ground forward with unstoppable momentum. We were no longer simply playing defense against a fraudulent marriage contract. We were actively digging up the very corpses she foolishly believed she had completely permanently left behind in the dark. The district judge reviewed Bradley's injunction during an emergency closed-door hearing. The combination of Eleanor's sworn affidavit and my verified toxicology reports provided overwhelming probable cause. The judge did not hesitate. He signed the exhumation order and authorized a full forensic autopsy of Arthur's remains. He placed a strict gag order on the proceedings to prevent Valerie from catching wind of the impending exhumation and attempting to destroy the gravesite. I did not rely on the overwhelmed local county medical examiner to conduct the autopsy. I used my corporate resources to hire an independent team of elite forensic pathologists. I paid a premium to keep them on standby at a secure private facility. They specialized in detecting degraded chemical toxins in exhumed tissue. They were armed with advanced spectrometry equipment capable of identifying microscopic concentrations of digitalis in bone marrow and preserved organic matter. Gavin dispatched a covert surveillance team to the municipal cemetery. They established a secure perimeter around Arthur's grave to ensure nobody tampered with the site before the recovery team arrived. Heavy machinery moved into position under the cover of darkness. The backhoe broke the frosted ground at exactly midnight. The operation ran with the synchronized efficiency of a military strike. The heavy steel vault was lifted from the earth and loaded directly into an unmarked transport van. Gavin sent me a single encrypted text message containing a photograph of the rusted casket secured in the vehicle. The physical extraction was fully successful. Arthur was officially out of the ground. The physical evidence required to lock Valerie in a federal penitentiary for the remainder of her natural life was currently traveling down the interstate toward my waiting medical team. We absolutely controlled the entire playing board. Every single piece was moving exactly as I carefully designed today. I sat across from Valerie in the formal dining room. The heavy crystal chandelier cast a warm, deceptive light over our evening meal. She served a roasted chicken and poured 2 glasses of expensive red wine. She smiled, chatting excitedly about the floral arrangements for our impending courthouse wedding on Friday. I matched her rhythm perfectly. I nodded, chewed my food, and offered the exact responses of a complacent aging fiancé. My internal foundation was rock solid. The digitalis slowed my heart, but my mind had never operated with such absolute brutal clarity. The trap was set. We were waiting for the trigger. It happened right as she served the dessert. Valerie's private cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany table. It was not a text. It was a persistent, aggressive, incoming call. She glanced at the screen. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She excused herself, claiming it was a late call from her wedding planner. She stood up and walked toward the kitchen to answer it. She did not know I had planted a micro-audio transmitter beneath the kitchen island. I listened through my discreet earpiece. The caller was not a wedding planner. It was a panicked former associate from her hometown. The contact hysterically informed Valerie that heavy machinery and federal agents had just ripped Arthur's casket out of the municipal cemetery grounds. Valerie did not respond. She did not ask questions. I heard the sharp, terrifying intake of her breath. She walked back into the dining room. The confident predator was completely gone. Her face was ash white. Her hands shook violently. She stared at me, her eyes wide with sudden suffocating panic. She suddenly realized the absolute undeniable truth: the cold earth was literally opening up to violently swallow her whole tonight. Valerie slowly lowered the phone from her ear. The color had completely vanished from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent white. Her eyes darted wildly around the dining room as her mind scrambled to process the catastrophic news. The foundation of her previous murder was being dug up by federal agents, and she knew the digital clock on her freedom was ticking down to zero. She turned to me. The panic in her chest morphed instantly into frantic, aggressive action. She walked across the room and grabbed both of my hands. Her palms were freezing cold and slick with sweat. She looked up at me with an engineered expression of desperate devotion. She told me she had a sudden, overwhelming realization about the fragility of life. She insisted we could not wait for the Friday courthouse appointment. She demanded we cancel those plans immediately. She wanted to marry me tomorrow morning right here in the living room. She claimed she had a private officiant on standby, an old friend who owed her a favor. She spun a frantic narrative about how much she loved me and how she needed to be my legal wife before another day passed. I looked down into her wide, terrified eyes. I knew exactly why she was accelerating the timeline. She needed my estate secured before the autopsy results hit the federal database and triggered her arrest warrant. She needed to kill me and cash out before the sun set tomorrow. I maintained my absolute composure. I did not blink or hesitate. I gave her a warm, reassuring smile. I told her tomorrow morning sounded absolutely perfect. The trap was moving forward, and I needed to test the exact depth of her depravity. I turned away from her to pick up my half-empty wine glass from the mahogany table. It was time to execute a precise, tactical simulation. I needed to see exactly how she would react when the digitalist finally crushed my cardiovascular system. I took a slow breath and deliberately dropped the crystal glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crash. Red wine splattered across the baseboards like fresh blood. I gasped loudly and clutched the center of my chest with both hands. I forced my knees to buckle, dropping heavily to the floor amid the broken glass. I contorted my face in a mask of agonizing pain, letting out short, ragged breaths. I stared up at Valerie from the floor. This was the ultimate test. A normal human being would scream. A loving partner would drop to the ground, grab her phone, and dial emergency services immediately. Valerie did absolutely nothing. She stood perfectly still. Her posture was rigid and relaxed all at once. She looked down at me, writhing on the floor, her eyes devoid of any panic or empathy. She did not reach for her phone. She did not shout for help. She simply watched me struggle with clinical fascination. Then a slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey finally succumb to the venom. She stood over me, entirely prepared to let me suffocate and die on my own dining room floor. She was waiting for the final breath so she could step over my corpse and claim my fortune. Her silence was the absolute confirmation of her monstrous nature. I committed that cold, sociopathic smile to my memory. It fueled the icy resolve I needed to completely destroy her. I let the silence stretch for 10 agonizing seconds before I initiated the recovery phase of my simulation. I forced a deep, stabilizing breath into my lungs. I loosened my grip on my shirt and slowly pushed myself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the edge of the dining table. The moment I showed signs of stabilization, Valerie's predatory smile vanished instantly. Her face snapped back into a mask of exaggerated, frantic concern. She rushed forward, placing a cold hand on my back, asking loudly if I was all right and if she should call a doctor. I waved her off with a dismissive gesture. I forced a weak chuckle and blamed the sudden pain on a severe bout of heartburn and muscle cramping. I told her the stress of the wedding planning must be catching up with me. She stepped back, nodding in rapid agreement, though her eyes betrayed a flash of deep frustration. Her timeline had not been met. My heart had not stopped. I watched her turn away under the pretense of giving me space to breathe. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket and began typing furiously. Her thumbs moved with frantic speed over the screen. I knew exactly who she was messaging. She was coordinating with her corrupt real estate brokers and offshore buyers. She was warning them that the target was showing severe physical distress and that the asset liquidation needed to happen immediately after the rushed ceremony tomorrow. She was finalizing the logistics of my assassination while standing 10 feet away from me. I leaned against the table, steadying my breathing, memorizing her every movement. She believed she was adjusting the variables of her master plan. She was entirely unaware that I controlled the entire board. I pushed myself away from the dining table and feigned absolute exhaustion. I shuffled into the adjacent living room, dragging my feet to sell the illusion of a failing cardiovascular system. I slumped heavily into my large leather armchair. Valerie followed me, watching my every move like a hawk. I told her I needed to rest my eyes and perhaps get some fresh air outside to clear my head. She agreed quickly, eager to have me out of the house so she could finalize her illicit arrangements. She turned her back and walked toward the kitchen to fetch a broom for the broken glass. The moment she was out of sight, I reached into the concealed pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. My fingers wrapped around a high-grade military micro-recorder Gavin had provided me earlier that day. The device was no larger than a coin and equipped with a powerful magnetic backing and a voice-activated transmitter. I leaned forward in the armchair, reached under the thick wooden frame of the coffee table, and pressed the device against a hidden metal bracket. It locked into place with a faint, inaudible click. The trap was now armed and actively transmitting to a secure server. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked toward the front door. Valerie emerged from the kitchen, her phone still tightly gripped in her hand. I told her I was going to take a slow drive around the neighborhood to clear the heartburn completely. She smiled and told me not to take too long. I walked out into the cool night air and got into my truck. I left her alone in the house, surrounded by the invisible wires of her impending destruction. The audio feed was live, and I was ready to listen to her confess. I parked my truck exactly 1 block away under the heavy canopy of an ancient oak tree. I killed the engine and plunged the cabin into total darkness. The earpiece hummed with a faint crackle of static before the audio feed stabilized into crystal-clear reception. I heard the crunch of heavy tires rolling onto the crushed gravel of my circular driveway. A vehicle door slammed shut, followed quickly by 2 more. Heavy footsteps ascended the front porch. The front door opened. Valerie did not greet them with the warm, manufactured affection she reserved for our neighbors. Her voice was sharp, brittle, and entirely devoid of emotion. She ushered 3 individuals into the living room. They were not concerned friends rushing to support a frantic bride. I recognized the distinct, arrogant cadence of their voices immediately. It was Richard, a disgraced commercial developer I had blacklisted a decade ago, accompanied by 2 of his offshore financial fixers. They were corporate scavengers. They were the buyers Valerie had secretly lined up to carve up my estate. The men did not offer congratulations on the impending wedding. Richard immediately complained about the accelerated timeline. He stated that moving a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction up by 48 hours exposed them to unnecessary federal scrutiny. Valerie cut him off with a vicious snap. She informed him that the original Friday timeline was dead. She did not mention the exhumation of her first husband, but the raw panic bleeding through her demanding tone conveyed the absolute urgency of the situation. She told them they would either execute the transfer tomorrow afternoon as dictated, or she would find another syndicate to purchase the portfolio at a steep discount. The vultures quickly fell in line. I leaned back against the cold leather seat of my truck, closing my eyes to focus entirely on the audio transmission. The men spread blueprints and financial dossiers across my custom glass coffee table. I listened as they methodically dismantled 40 years of my blood, sweat, and engineering brilliance. They discussed the liquidation of my commercial warehouses, the margin of profit on flipping my residential developments, and the exact offshore routing protocols required to wash the capital clean. Richard outlined a complex web of Cayman Island holding accounts designed to absorb the cash payout before any domestic tax authority could flag the sudden transfer of wealth. They were dissecting my life with the clinical detachment of butchers at a slaughterhouse. One of the fixers expressed hesitation regarding my physical presence. He pointed out that I was still actively managing the firm and might notice the sudden shift in property deeds. Valerie laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that chilled the air inside my truck. She assured them the primary asset was already severely compromised. She proudly recounted my sudden collapse in the dining room just an hour prior. She described how I dropped my glass and clutched my chest, struggling to breathe on the hardwood floor. She presented my fabricated agony as empirical proof that her biological demolition was proceeding perfectly. She guaranteed them I was fading fast and lacked the cognitive stamina to review any legal paperwork presented to me. I gripped the steering wheel, mapping out every voice, every name, and every financial routing number mentioned on the recording. They were handing me the exact coordinates of their criminal network. The conversation inevitably shifted from financial logistics to the physical execution of the obstacles standing in their way. Richard demanded absolute assurance that I would not survive the week to contest the fraudulent property transfers. He needed a guarantee that the estate would transition to Valerie without a protracted legal battle. Valerie provided that guarantee with terrifying specificity. The micro-recorder captured every single syllable of her premeditated confession. She explicitly outlined the digitalis poisoning. She detailed how she had replaced my daily beta blockers with lethal doses of the cardiac glycoside, slowly saturating my heart muscle to the point of imminent failure. She explained that the sudden change in the wedding timeline required a slight adjustment to the murder plot. Instead of waiting for Friday night, she had booked a private charter flight for tomorrow afternoon under the guise of an impromptu romantic honeymoon to the Caribbean. She laid out the fatal mechanics with the precision of a seasoned assassin. She explained that the accumulated digitalis in my system, combined with the sudden shifts in cabin pressure and the physical stress of high-altitude flight, would trigger an unavoidable and catastrophic myocardial infarction mid-air. She would instruct the pilot to make an emergency landing, but I would be dead long before the wheels touched the tarmac. A sudden tragedy over international waters would ensure minimal local police interference and completely eliminate the possibility of an immediate autopsy. She would return as a devastated widow holding all the cards. I listened to the men murmur their approval. I had the golden evidence. She had just handed me a recorded explicit confession to attempted murder and conspiracy. The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place when one of the offshore fixers questioned the legality of the rushed wedding ceremony. He asked how Valerie intended to secure my signature on the total asset transfer deeds if we were getting married in the living room rather than the courthouse. He worried a standard wedding officiant might notice the massive discrepancy in the paperwork. Valerie's response dripped with arrogant amusement. She announced that the officiant arriving tomorrow morning was not a legitimate minister. She had enlisted Marcus, a corrupt, disbarred notary public who specialized in authorizing fraudulent corporate documents for the underground market. Marcus was going to pose as an ordained minister to conduct the fake ceremony. Valerie explained that the marriage certificate would merely act as a decoy. Hidden directly beneath it, seamlessly mixed into the stack of celebratory paperwork, would be the ironclad deed transfers assigning my entire fortune to her offshore syndicate. Marcus would legally stamp and authenticate the transfer right in front of my eyes, sealing my financial doom before I even boarded the fatal flight. She had engineered a flawless, seamless trap. I opened my eyes in the dark cabin of my truck. A cold, dangerous smile spread across my face. I pulled my secure prepaid phone from my pocket and drafted a highly encrypted message to Bradley. I instructed him to finalize the counterfeit deeds and prepare the federal fraud unit for a coordinated strike tomorrow morning. Valerie believed she had surrounded me with a pack of invisible wolves. She did not realize I had just locked the cage from the outside. I started the engine, pulling away from the curb to return to the estate and play the role of the doomed groom one final time. The morning sun filtered through the heavy silk drapes of the living room, casting long, elegant shadows across the polished hardwood floor. Valerie moved with a frantic, manufactured joy. She wore a pristine white dress, her hair pinned up in a flawless arrangement, projecting the absolute image of a blushing, devoted bride. She hummed a quiet, cheerful tune while arranging a small bouquet of lilies on the stone mantelpiece. I sat deep in my leather armchair, wearing a dark, tailored suit, breathing with deliberate, shallow breaths to maintain the illusion of a failing cardiovascular system. Exactly at 9 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the quiet foyer. Valerie rushed to answer it, her heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. She pulled the door open to reveal a tall, gaunt man clutching a thick, battered leather briefcase. He wore a cheap dark suit and carried a small leather-bound book designed to mimic a religious text. Valerie introduced him as Marcus, the private officiant she had secured at the last minute for our intimate ceremony. She brought him into the living room, her face glowing with feigned gratitude. I did not stand up to greet him. I remained seated and let my eyes lock onto his face. I recognized him instantly. Time and desperation had worn down his features, but the sharp, rodent-like structure of his jaw was unmistakable. Marcus was not an ordained minister. He was a disgraced, disbarred corporate lawyer. 10 years ago, he served as the primary legal counsel for a rival commercial developer attempting a hostile takeover of my downtown sector. I had personally dismantled their illegal operation in federal court, exposing Marcus for gross financial misconduct and ensuring his permanent disbarment. He stood in my living room, sweating nervously, completely unaware that the man he was trying to scam had already destroyed his entire career a decade prior. Marcus cleared his throat, pulling at the tight collar of his cheap shirt, and opened his small, leather-bound book. The performance was offensively brief and entirely void of sincerity. He recited a handful of generic hollow vows, his eyes darting anxiously toward the heavy briefcase resting on my glass coffee table. Valerie knelt beside my chair and held my hands. Her palms were freezing cold and damp with raw anticipation. She stared deeply into my eyes, whispering her forged promises of eternal love, sickness, and health. I mirrored her absolute falsehood perfectly, returning her intense gaze with a weak, weary smile that concealed my cold fury. The moment the fake ceremony concluded, the manufactured romance evaporated from the room. Valerie did not lean in for a kiss. She immediately turned to Marcus and gave a sharp, commanding nod. Marcus snapped his briefcase open and pulled out a massive, intimidating stack of legal documents. He placed them directly in front of me on the coffee table alongside a heavy gold fountain pen. Valerie placed a comforting, maternal hand on my knee. She explained in a soft, soothing tone that these were simply the standard marital documents required for the state registry. She claimed her lawyer had expedited the paperwork to ensure our union was fully recognized before our impromptu honeymoon flight that afternoon. I looked down at the thick pile of paper. The top sheet was a convincing replica of a county marriage license. But my trained eye easily caught the dense, complex corporate phrasing bleeding through the edges of the pages beneath it. The stack contained comprehensive asset transfer deeds, total corporate relinquishment forms, and irrevocable offshore routing authorizations. She had hidden the total surrender of my 40-year empire beneath a single sheet of matrimonial bureaucracy. She gently nudged the gold pen toward my hand, urging me to sign my life away before the fabricated pain in my chest returned. I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen. It felt cold and metallic against my skin. My hand trembled, an intentional and highly calculated micro-tremor I generated to sell the illusion of my rapidly deteriorating physical state. Valerie leaned in closer, her breathing growing shallow and rapid with pure, unfiltered greed. Marcus hovered over my right shoulder like a starving vulture, his bony finger tapping impatiently against the edge of the coffee table to indicate exactly where I needed to press the ink. I let out a ragged, exhausted sigh, allowing my posture to slump heavily into the cushions of the armchair. I positioned the tip of the pen against the thick parchment. I signed the first page, moving my hand slowly and deliberately. Valerie quickly flipped to the next page, eagerly exposing the corporate transfer deeds and offshore banking mandates. I continued signing, methodically pressing the black ink into the paper. I did not write my actual legal signature. I executed a microscopic, highly specific structural alteration that I had practiced for decades. When I reached the final letter of my last name, I added an inverted secondary loop to the R. I disconnected the primary stroke, creating a tiny, almost imperceptible gap in the ink line. I applied this exact morphological variation to every single signature line across the entire stack of fraudulent documents. To the untrained eye, it looked exactly like the natural, sloppy handwriting of an exhausted, dying man struggling to hold a pen. Valerie and Marcus watched the ink flow entirely blinded by their own anticipated victory. They saw a broken man surrendering his empire without a fight. They did not see a master engineer planting a fatal structural defect directly into the foundation of their criminal enterprise. I finished the final page, letting the pen slip from my fingers and clatter loudly against the glass surface. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes, projecting total physical submission. Valerie snatched the heavy stack of papers from the table, the absolute second the pen left my hand. She did not even attempt to hide her ferocious triumph. She clutched the documents tightly against her chest, her eyes wide and burning with the thrill of victory. Marcus quickly gathered his empty briefcase, nodding sharply at Valerie before walking straight out the front door without offering a single word of farewell or congratulations. Valerie stood in the center of the living room, staring down at the ink on the pages. A genuine, radiant smile broke across her face. She believed she had just captured millions of dollars in untraceable offshore assets. She believed she had outsmarted a man who had spent his entire life building indestructible fortresses. She had absolutely no idea what she was actually holding. 40 years ago, when I first incorporated my structural engineering firm, I anticipated the constant threat of extortion and forced corporate espionage. I worked with Bradley to embed a hidden biometric and graphological failsafe into my foundational charter. Any legal document bearing that specific inverted loop on the final letter was instantly classified as a distress signature. That microscopic misspelling automatically and legally flagged the document as signed under extreme duress and physical threat. It triggered an immediate, irrevocable nullification of the contract in any federal or state jurisdiction across the globe. The papers she clutched so desperately to her chest were not worth the ink printed on them. They were legally dead. They were utterly useless. Valerie turned to me, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, and told me to rest before our private flight to the Caribbean. I nodded weakly, keeping my eyes closed. She was leaving the house to finalize her offshore wire transfers, completely unaware she was holding a stack of worthless garbage. The final trap was locked, and the countdown to her arrest had officially begun. I watched Valerie turn the doorknob, her knuckles white with the thrill of her impending victory. I called out to her, my voice weak and raspy, perfectly mimicking the final stages of severe cardiovascular fatigue. She stopped and turned around, her mask of fake concern instantly snapping back into place. I told her that I could not let her bear the logistical financial burden of our impromptu Caribbean honeymoon. I insisted on funding the entire excursion. I explained that I wanted to transfer $500,000 directly into her primary account to cover the private charter flight, the luxury villa, and any immediate expenses she might incur while I rested. The sheer magnitude of the number stopped her dead in her tracks. She had just secured what she believed was my entire corporate empire, but the immediate promise of $500,000 in liquid cash was an irresistible temptation. I leaned back in my armchair, rubbing my chest slowly, watching the raw greed overriding her tactical caution. I told her my primary banking portal required an external routing number to authorize an immediate expedited wire transfer of that size. I requested she write down her most secure account details so I could initiate the transaction before my afternoon nap. She did not question the logic. She did not hesitate. The prospect of draining my liquid capital hours before my planned execution was simply too alluring. She released the doorknob and walked briskly back toward the coffee table. Valerie pulled a pristine piece of hotel stationery from her designer purse. She picked up the heavy gold fountain pen I had just used to sign my fabricated death warrant. Her hand moved with rapid, practiced precision as she scribbled down a series of complex alphanumeric codes. She was not handing me the details of a standard domestic checking account. She was providing the exact international routing numbers and SWIFT codes for the offshore shell companies she had established in the Cayman Islands. These were the highly secured, untraceable shadow accounts she intended to use to launder the proceeds from the fraudulent sale of my estate. She slid the paper across the glass table toward me, her eyes shining with absolute triumph. She leaned down and kissed my forehead, a chillingly cold gesture of false affection. She told me to initiate the transfer quickly and get some sleep, promising to return in exactly 3 hours to take me to the airstrip. I took the paper, nodding weakly. I folded the note with trembling fingers and tucked it safely into my breast pocket. I thanked her for handling the heavy burden of our travel arrangements. She smiled brilliantly, turned on her heel, and walked out the front door. The heavy wood clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the silent house. The moment I heard her car engine start and the tires crunch down the driveway, the frail dying man vanished. I sat up straight, my posture rigid and energized. My heart rate was perfectly stable. I pulled the piece of paper from my pocket and stared at the handwritten routing numbers. Valerie's insatiable greed had just blinded her to the most fundamental rule of financial warfare. She had voluntarily handed me the keys to her sanctuary. I did not log into my banking portal. I did not initiate a wire transfer. I pulled my secure encrypted phone from my jacket and flattened Valerie's handwritten note against the glass surface of the coffee table. I snapped a high-resolution photograph of the offshore routing numbers. I opened a direct, heavily encrypted messaging channel to Bradley. I attached the image and typed a single decisive command. I instructed him to forward the routing data directly to the federal fraud investigators monitoring our tactical trap. Bradley was already stationed at his desk in the Sterling corporate tower, coordinating the legal assault with the authorities. He received the transmission instantly. Within 60 seconds, Bradley confirmed receipt of the offshore account structures. He informed me that the federal agents were currently plugging Valerie's international routing numbers into the global financial tracking grid. Valerie had designed these shell companies to be entirely invisible, masking the true beneficiary behind layers of corporate anonymity. By voluntarily handing me the exact deposit coordinates in her own handwriting, she had completely bypassed her own security protocols. She had given the federal government a direct map straight to her hidden vault. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water. I drank it slowly, savoring the absolute control I now possessed over the timeline. Valerie was currently driving across the city to meet with Richard and her syndicate of corrupt brokers. She believed she was finalizing the liquidation of my estate and preparing for her massive payout. Instead, she was driving straight into a financial void. Every single piece of evidence required to trigger a catastrophic federal intervention was now securely in the hands of the authorities. The federal response was brutal, instantaneous, and completely invisible. Armed with the precise routing numbers Valerie had provided, the fraud division executed a coordinated global asset freeze. They contacted the international banking authorities overseeing the Cayman Island jurisdictions. They utilized the active homicide investigation regarding Arthur's exhumed remains and the documented evidence of domestic real estate fraud to secure immediate international cooperation. Warrants were electronically dispatched across multiple time zones. Within 15 minutes of Bradley forwarding the photograph, the massive iron doors of global finance slammed shut on Valerie's entire operation. Every single offshore account tied to those routing numbers was permanently locked. Incoming transfers were blocked. Outgoing wire capabilities were completely paralyzed. Her liquid assets, her hidden emergency funds, and the very accounts she intended to use to hold the stolen millions from my estate were instantly frozen under federal mandate. She was entirely stripped of her financial mobility in the blink of an eye. I stood by the large bay window in my living room, looking out over the manicured lawn. I checked my watch. Valerie was likely sitting in a sleek office downtown at this exact moment, smiling at Richard and her network of corporate scavengers. She was finalizing the illicit sale of my home, fully expecting the massive influx of cash to hit her accounts by mid-afternoon. She was entirely unaware that she was now completely bankrupt. She possessed no liquid capital, her fraudulent contracts were legally dead, and her international safe havens were under federal lockdown. The meticulously planned assassination and corporate theft had been entirely neutralized. I slipped my jacket on and walked out the front door. It was time to head to the private airstrip. It was time to watch her realize the trap had sprung. The heavy iron gates of Oakwood Sanctuary stood silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, projecting an illusion of absolute medical authority. Gavin bypassed the main visitor entrance entirely. He maneuvered his unmarked black SUV through the secondary service road, parking precisely within the blind spot of the perimeter security cameras. He did not wear his standard tactical gear. He wore a sharp charcoal gray suit projecting the undeniable aura of a high-level federal litigator. He carried a sleek leather briefcase containing the absolute destruction of Valerie's carefully constructed medical prison. Gavin approached the rear staff entrance with long, determined strides. He bypassed the keypad scanner using a universal electronic override he had acquired hours earlier. The heavy steel door clicked open, granting him silent access to the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the nursing facility. The night shift operated on a skeleton crew, just as his preliminary surveillance had indicated. Gavin walked directly to the primary nurse's station on the third floor. The solitary orderly seated behind the desk looked up, her eyes wide with sudden alarm at the unauthorized intrusion. Before she could reach for the emergency panic button, Gavin placed a thick stack of documents directly onto the reception counter. They were not requests or inquiries. They were absolute ironclad mandates. The top page bore the official seal of a federal judge secured by Bradley just before the financial freeze took effect. Gavin spoke in a voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation or delay. He announced that he held a court-ordered immediate medical release for the patients residing in room 314. He demanded unrestricted access to Thomas and Martha instantly. The orderly stammered her hand, hovering over the telephone receiver. She stated that those specific patients were under a strict no-contact lockdown authorized by Valerie. Gavin did not flinch. He simply tapped a manicured finger against the judge's signature. The commotion at the front desk drew the attention of the facility manager, a tall, imposing man who emerged from a back office. He recognized the immediate threat to his lucrative arrangement with Valerie. He puffed out his chest, stepping between Gavin and the terrified orderly. He declared that Oakwood Sanctuary operated under strict private protocols and that federal mandates required internal legal review before execution. He reached for the heavy desk phone, announcing his intention to contact the primary medical proxy. He was going to call Valerie to warn her that her fortress was under siege. Gavin anticipated this exact response. He did not raise his voice or draw a weapon. He calmly reached into his tailored jacket and produced a second, highly specific legal document. He slammed it down on top of the release papers with a sharp, echoing crack. It was a pre-signed federal obstruction of justice warrant. Gavin leaned over the counter, closing the physical distance between himself and the manager. He explained the situation with ruthless clarity. He stated that the financial network funding Oakwood Sanctuary had just been frozen by federal authorities in a global sweep. He informed the manager that Valerie was currently the target of a massive homicide and fraud investigation. Gavin offered the man a simple, brutal choice. He could step aside and comply with the lawful extraction of the hostages, or he could pick up the phone, become an active accomplice in a federal conspiracy, and leave the building in handcuffs. The manager stared at the obstruction warrant, his arrogance evaporating instantly. The color drained from his face as he comprehended the catastrophic legal reality. He slowly pulled his hand away from the telephone receiver. He nodded silently, surrendering the floor. He handed Gavin the master electronic keycard required to unlock the high-security ward. The perimeter was broken. Gavin moved down the sterile, chemically scented hallway with swift, silent purpose. He swiped the master keycard against the electronic lock of room 314. The heavy door hissed open, revealing a dimly lit room that felt more like a solitary confinement cell than a medical recovery suite. Thomas and Martha sat huddled together on the edge of a narrow institutional bed. They looked frail, exhausted, and entirely defeated by the months of psychological torture and chemical restraint Valerie had forced upon them. They recoiled slightly as the door opened, expecting another dose of sedatives or another cruel visit from the facility staff. Gavin stepped into the room and immediately softened his posture. He spoke in a quiet, deeply respectful tone. He identified himself as an associate of Lawrence, stating clearly that the nightmare was officially over. The mention of my name sparked a sudden, desperate light in Thomas's eyes. Martha gasped, clutching her husband's arm. Gavin did not waste time with lengthy explanations. He informed them that a secure vehicle was waiting outside and they needed to move immediately before the day shift arrived. He produced 2 heavy warm coats from his briefcase and draped them over the shivering couple. He guided them out of the room, keeping a protective stance as they navigated the long corridor. The facility staff stood frozen at the nurse's station, watching the extraction in absolute, terrified silence. Nobody dared to intervene. Gavin escorted Thomas and Martha through the rear service exit and out into the crisp pre-dawn air. He opened the reinforced doors of his black SUV, helping the elderly couple slide into the secure, tinted interior. As the heavy doors locked shut, a profound wave of relief washed over the vehicle. The hostages were successfully extracted. The physical chain Valerie had wrapped around their lives was permanently shattered. Gavin drove the SUV smoothly through the quiet city streets, actively checking his mirrors to ensure they were not being followed. He navigated away from the industrial zones and headed straight toward the gleaming glass structures of the financial district. He pulled into the private, heavily guarded subterranean garage of the Sterling corporate tower. The security personnel recognized Gavin's vehicle and immediately waved him through to the VIP elevator bay. He escorted Thomas and Martha directly into the private lift, swiping his encrypted clearance card to access the highest level of the building. The elevator doors opened to reveal my sprawling multi-million-dollar corporate penthouse. The space was a fortress of glass, steel, and absolute security positioned high above the city skyline. Bradley stood waiting in the massive living room, flanked by 2 highly trained private nurses he had hired to evaluate the couple's physical condition. Gavin led Thomas and Martha to the plush leather sofas, offering them hot coffee and genuine safety. The private medical team immediately began checking their vitals, ensuring the lingering effects of Valerie's chemical restraints were flushed from their systems. Thomas gripped his coffee mug, his hands trembling with a mixture of residual fear and overwhelming gratitude. He looked around the secure, opulent penthouse and finally realized they were untouchable. Bradley stepped forward, introducing himself as my lead counsel. He placed a fresh set of legal transcripts on the table. He informed Thomas and Martha that their sworn testimony was the final devastating piece required to lock Valerie in a federal penitentiary forever. Martha sat up straight, a fierce, unbreakable resolve replacing her previous exhaustion. She nodded firmly, stating they were ready to expose every single lie Valerie had spun. The ultimate witnesses were now secured, fully armed with the truth, and eager to deliver the fatal blow. The sunlight pierced through the high, arched windows of the estate. It was the morning Valerie believed she would finally become a wildly wealthy widow. She moved through the kitchen with the brisk, efficient energy of an executioner preparing the gallows. I sat at the mahogany dining table wearing the dark wool suit she had picked out for our supposed honeymoon flight to the Caribbean. I kept my shoulders slumped, my breathing shallow and labored, maintaining the flawless illusion of a man on the absolute brink of total heart failure. Valerie approached me, holding a steaming porcelain mug of dark roast coffee. her manicured fingers wrapped tightly around the handle. She placed it directly in front of me on the polished wood. The heavy, bitter aroma of the coffee could not completely mask the faint chemical undertone of the crushed digitalis she had mixed into the brew. This was her masterpiece. This was the massive, lethal dose designed to push my already saturated cardiovascular system over the edge the moment our private charter reached high altitude. She crouched beside my chair, resting her cold hand lightly on my arm. She looked up at me with wide, manufactured eyes full of deep, tender concern. She spoke in a soft, soothing whisper, insisting that I drink the entire cup to give me the energy required for the long journey ahead. She promised that once we reached the island villa, I could sleep for days. She was meticulously setting the final timer on my life. She watched my trembling hands reach for the porcelain mug, her breathing hitching slightly with pure, unadulterated anticipation. I wrapped my fingers around the warm porcelain. The manufactured tremor in my hands ceased entirely. I did not bring the edge of the cup to my lips. Instead, I stood up from the dining chair. The sudden fluid motion lacked any trace of the agonizing stiffness I had projected for the past 3 months. I stood at my full height, towering over her crouching form. I looked down at her, my expression stripped of all the engineered vulnerability and fabricated exhaustion. I held the mug steadily in my right hand and turned my back to her. I walked across the kitchen floor with a heavy, measured, and absolute stride. I stopped directly in front of the stainless steel sink. I did not look at the drain. I turned my head slowly, locking my gaze entirely onto Valerie's face. I maintained absolute unblinking eye contact as I tilted the porcelain mug. The dark, poisoned liquid poured out in a thick, steaming stream, splashing violently against the metal basin and spiraling down into the dark drain. I emptied the entire cup, letting the last few lethal drops fall away. I set the empty mug down on the granite counter with a sharp, echoing crack that shattered the heavy silence of the kitchen. I did not break eye contact for a single second. I let her watch her flawless, meticulously calculated murder plot wash away into the sewer. I stood perfectly still, projecting the cold, indestructible strength of a man who controlled every single variable in the room. She had spent months treating me like a fragile, dying animal waiting to be slaughtered. Now she was forced to watch me dismantle the very weapon she intended to use for my execution. The raw, unfiltered dominance in my posture clearly communicated that I was not a victim. I was the architect of this entire confrontation. Valerie froze completely. Her lungs seemingly forgot how to process oxygen. The color instantly drained from her perfectly powdered face, leaving her skin a stark, sickly white. The wide, devoted eyes of the loving bride vanished, replaced immediately by the terrified, darting gaze of a cornered predator, realizing the trap had just snapped shut on its own neck. She pushed herself up from the floor, stumbling slightly backwards against the edge of the dining table. Her mind frantically scrambled to process the impossible visual information. The frail, dying old man she had been slowly poisoning for months was gone. He had never existed. In his place stood an apex corporate predator radiating aggressive, unyielding vitality. She looked at the empty coffee mug on the counter, then back to my steady, unblinking eyes. The devastating reality crashed down upon her shoulders. I was not dying. My heart was not failing. The entire performance of my physical decline had been a highly calibrated illusion, designed specifically to map out the exact depths of her sociopathy. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. The sweet maternal facade she used to manipulate the world melted off her face like wax, exposing the raw, ugly panic of a criminal stripped of all her leverage. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin a frantic lie, to ask why I had poured out the coffee, but her vocal cords refused to function. She was paralyzed by the overwhelming, suffocating presence of a man she suddenly realized she did not know at all. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy with unspoken accusations. Every calculated move she had made, every fake tear she had shed, and every lethal pill she had crushed was now laid bare in the bright morning light. She had severely underestimated the man she intended to kill. I shattered the suffocating silence with a voice forged in absolute cold authority. "We are not getting married here." I dictated my tone, leaving absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. I stepped away from the kitchen counter and walked directly toward her, forcing her to shrink back against the mahogany table. I dictated the new parameters of her survival. I informed her that my private driver was currently idling outside the front gates in the armored executive vehicle. I stated we were going directly to the Sterling corporate tower. We were going to march into the primary boardroom and finalize the total estate transfer before the entire board of directors. I framed this sudden shift as a mandatory legal formality, a necessary public declaration to ensure no federal regulator could ever contest her absolute ownership of my empire once the paperwork was filed. It was a blatant, highly engineered psychological trap. A rational human being possessing an ounce of self-preservation would have turned and run out the back door. But Valerie was entirely consumed by the toxic, blinding poison of her own greed. The mere mention of the total estate transfer, the tantalizing promise of officially securing the billions she had killed for, instantly overrode her terrified survival instincts. She could not walk away from the finish line. Her mind desperately rationalized my behavior, clinging to the hope that she was still somehow in control of the vast fortune. She nodded frantically, her eyes wide with a desperate, manic hunger. She grabbed her designer purse and followed me out the front door, stepping willingly into the armored vehicle that would deliver her directly to her own destruction. The trap had successfully weaponized her greatest weakness. She was marching into a boardroom filled with federal agents and the damning testimonies of the hostages she thought she had buried away. She was walking blindly into the execution of her own sentence. The heavy reinforced doors of the executive SUV closed with a deep pressurized thud, instantly severing us from the ambient noise of the estate grounds. The interior of the vehicle was a masterpiece of custom engineering lined with immaculate black leather and sound-dampening acoustic panels. I sat rigidly on the passenger side, my posture projecting the unyielding authority I had carefully concealed for months. Valerie sat beside me, her pristine white dress starkly contrasting with the dark upholstery. The initial rush of greedy adrenaline that had propelled her out of the house was beginning to curdle into cold apprehension. The enclosed space forced her to sit within inches of a man she suddenly recognized as a complete stranger. She shifted uncomfortably against the leather, her eyes darting between my impassive profile and the opaque tinted windows. Desperation drove her to seek reassurance from her criminal syndicate. She needed to confirm that Marcus had successfully filed the fraudulent documents and that the offshore wire transfers were processing. She slipped her manicured hand into her designer purse and retrieved her phone. Her thumbs moved rapidly across the glass screen, intending to dispatch an urgent encrypted message to Richard. She tapped the screen with increasing frantic energy. The message failed to send. She stared at the display, her perfectly sculpted brow furrowing in deep frustration. A harsh red icon blinked at the top corner of the screen. It displayed absolutely no service. She held the device higher, waving it slightly near the reinforced glass of the window, attempting to catch a passing cellular tower. The screen remained dead. The digital lifeline to her accomplices had been entirely severed. She was completely isolated, trapped in a rolling vault, moving rapidly toward a destination she could not control. I watched her frantic, mounting frustration from the corner of my eye. I allowed the silence to stretch, letting her anxiety steep until it reached a boiling point. I turned my head slowly, meeting her terrified gaze with an expression of absolute chilling calm. I informed her that waving her phone against the armored glass would not yield any results. I explained the specific tactical modifications of the vehicle we were riding in. I told her that a man responsible for a multi-billion-dollar international logistics empire could never risk corporate espionage or unauthorized surveillance during transit. I described the military-grade signal jammer integrated directly into the chassis of the SUV. The device projected a localized high-frequency disruption field that actively blocked all cellular satellite and GPS transmissions within a 50-foot radius. Her phone was entirely useless. It was a dead brick of glass and metal. The cold, mechanical reality of my explanation finally shattered the fragile shell of her greed. The intoxicating illusion of impending wealth evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the stark, terrifying truth of her captivity. Valerie dropped the phone into her lap. Her breathing escalated into ragged, shallow gasps. The calculated, devoted bride vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. She lunged forward, pressing her hands against the back of the driver's seat. She raised her voice, her tone shrill and demanding. She ordered the driver to pull over to the shoulder immediately. She fabricated a sudden, violent bout of nausea, claiming the motion of the heavy vehicle was making her sick. She demanded to be let out onto the sidewalk, screaming that the wedding plans needed to be canceled. She hammered her fists against the upholstery, fully abandoning any pretense of composure. The driver did not flinch. He did not slow the vehicle. He did not glance into the rearview mirror. His name was David, a former military operative who had managed my personal logistics and security details for over 15 years. He possessed absolute loyalty to my firm and followed my directives with flawless precision. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the road ahead, his hands steady on the leather steering wheel, completely ignoring Valerie's frantic screaming commands. I gave David a silent, almost imperceptible nod. He pressed a sequence of buttons on the master control console located on the dashboard. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed through the cabin as the electronic deadbolts engaged simultaneously across all 4 doors. The locking mechanism was not standard. It was a high-tensile steel vault lock designed to withstand external ballistic breaches and prevent internal forced exits. Valerie heard the sound and instantly threw her weight against the passenger door. She clawed frantically at the chrome handle, pulling and yanking with all her strength. The handle refused to yield. It was entirely disengaged from the locking mechanism. She was sealed inside a moving fortress. Before she could unleash another scream, David initiated the secondary containment protocol. The thick, soundproof privacy partition began to glide upward from the center console. The heavy panel of bulletproof glass sealed the rear cabin off completely, severing our physical and auditory connection to the driver. Valerie slammed her palms against the rising glass. Her shouts muted into pathetic, muffled thuds. She turned her back to the partition and pressed herself into the corner of the leather seat. She stared at me, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with the absolute realization that she had walked willingly into a meticulously engineered prison. The luxury SUV veered off the bustling downtown avenue, bypassing the grand, sunlit main entrance of the sterling corporate tower. David expertly maneuvered the heavy vehicle down a steep concrete ramp leading directly into the subterranean levels of the building. The bright morning light vanished, replaced instantly by the harsh, flickering glow of industrial fluorescent tubes. We descended past the standard parking levels, spiraling deeper into the earth toward the restricted executive sub-basement. This sector was entirely off-limits to standard employees and the public accessible only via encrypted clearance codes and biometric verification. The heavy security gate groaned open, granting us access to the cavernous concrete bunker. David brought the vehicle to a smooth, controlled halt inside a designated VIP parking bay. The engine idled with a low, menacing hum. Valerie pressed her face against the tinted glass, her breath fogging the window. Her desperate hope for an escape route was instantly crushed. The parking bay was not empty. A specialized team of 8 heavily armed private security contractors stood waiting in the shadows. They moved with absolute military synchronization, stepping forward to form a tight, impenetrable perimeter around the black SUV. They wore dark tactical uniforms, their hands resting cautiously near their holstered weapons, their eyes scanning the concrete pillars for any external threats. They were my personal guard, operating under direct orders to secure the asset and prevent any unauthorized departure. Valerie stared at the ring of armed men surrounding her. The cold, damp air of the underground garage seemed to seep through the armored doors, chilling her to the bone. There were no syndicates to call, no corrupt notary to forge her escape, and absolutely nowhere to run. The extraction was complete. The final judgment was waiting 40 stories above us. David disengaged the heavy vault locks with a sharp mechanical clack that echoed loudly through the subterranean concrete chamber. I stepped out of the passenger side, the cool, damp air of the underground garage providing a stark, refreshing contrast to the stifling, panicked tension inside the armored vehicle. I walked slowly around the front grille of the SUV, my footsteps steady and deliberate, while the private security team maintained their absolute, unyielding perimeter. I grasped the chrome handle of the rear door and pulled it open with a smooth, continuous motion. Valerie remained pressed hard against the far side of the luxurious leather seat, her pristine white wedding dress looking absurdly out of place in the grim, fluorescent-lit industrial bunker. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, cornered terror as she stared out at the ring of armed men. I extended my hand, gesturing toward the cold concrete floor. "After you," I stated, my voice echoing with an icy, calculated authority. The extreme courtesy was a psychological weapon, highlighting her complete lack of power. She did not move. Instead, she unleashed a sudden torrent of shrill, desperate threats. She screamed that I had absolutely no legal right to hold her against her will. She threatened to destroy my company, to sue every single security contractor standing in the room, and to expose me to the global press as a monster. Her voice cracked, echoing sharply off the massive concrete pillars, but not a single guard flinched or shifted their gaze. The men standing around the vehicle were highly compensated professionals loyal exclusively to my payroll. The lead contractor, a towering man with cold, disciplined eyes, stepped closer and placed a heavy hand on the edge of the open door. The absolute futility of her situation finally breached her manic panic. Trembling violently, she slid across the leather seat and stepped out onto the concrete floor. The security team instantly collapsed their perimeter, forming a tight, impenetrable phalanx around us. We moved across the expansive garage floor as a single, highly coordinated unit. I walked slightly behind her, guiding her trajectory without ever needing to make physical contact. Valerie stumbled repeatedly in her expensive heels, her breathing ragged and shallow as she desperately scanned the massive concrete expanse for any possible exit or hidden stairwell. There were none. The architecture of the sub-basement was engineered for absolute corporate containment. We reached the secure elevator bay, isolated from the main structural pillars by thick, floor-to-ceiling sheets of reinforced glass. The brushed steel doors of the private executive lift stood closed, serving as the final physical barrier between the underground bunker and the absolute apex of my corporate empire. I stepped past her shrinking form and approached the black, polished security console mounted seamlessly into the wall. I did not carry a standard keycard or a numeric code. I placed my right thumb directly against the illuminated biometric scanner. The machine pulsed with a faint green light, reading the unique topographical ridges of my print before confirming my identity with a soft electronic chime. The heavy steel doors glided open silently, revealing an immaculate interior paneled in dark cherry wood and mirrored glass. I stepped inside and turned to face her. The armed guards remained stationed outside, their posture rigid, effectively sealing off her only avenue of retreat. I looked at her directly and ordered her to step into the cabin. She hesitated, her body shaking visibly as she stared into the mirrored walls of the elevator. The reality of her total isolation was finally crushing her. She slowly crossed the threshold, her shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. The moment her feet cleared the track, the steel doors slid shut with a definitive airtight seal. The cabin jolted slightly as the high-speed lift engaged, beginning its rapid silent ascent toward the 40th floor. The sudden vertical motion seemed to jolt Valerie out of her paralyzed state. She spun around to face me, her back pressed hard against the cherrywood paneling. The primal instinct of a cornered predator flared up one final time in a desperate bid for control. She thrust a trembling manicured finger toward my chest, her voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch. She declared that I was committing a massive federal felony. She explicitly accused me of kidnapping, illegal detainment, and criminal coercion. She screamed that the absolute second these doors opened, she would find a landline, contact the local authorities, and ensure I spent the rest of my natural life locked inside a maximum security prison. Her bluff was loud, aggressive, and utterly hollow. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend my actions. I simply reached into the breast pocket of my tailored suit and retrieved my secure, fully operational cell phone. I unlocked the screen and extended the device directly toward her. The bright white light of the display illuminated the terrified, bloodless pallor of her face. "Dial 911. I challenged, my tone stripped of all human emotion. I instructed her to call the police immediately. I urged her to tell the federal dispatchers exactly what was happening. I told her to explain to the authorities how she had meticulously swapped my daily cardiovascular medication for lethal doses of digitalis. I encouraged her to detail the forged offshore routing numbers she had written down with her own hand, and to describe the corrupt, disbarred notary she had hired to authorize her corporate theft. The phone hovered between us, a digital guillotine waiting to drop. Valerie stared at the device, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated horror. She knew her hands were entirely coated in criminal intent. She slowly lowered her pointing finger, refusing to take the phone. I withdrew the device, slipping it casually back into my breast pocket. I watched the last remaining shreds of her fabricated confidence dissolve into absolute, paralyzing dread. The digital floor indicator above the door ticked upward with ruthless mechanical efficiency. 30, 35, 38. The air pressure in the cabin shifted subtly as we rapidly approached the apex of the sterling corporate tower. Valerie squeezed her eyes shut, crossing her arms tightly across her chest as if she could physically shield herself from the impending collision with reality. Her breathing was now a continuous series of quiet, ragged sobs. She had spent months engineering my physical destruction, meticulously calculating every variable of my death, and now she was entirely at the mercy of my survival. The elevator began its smooth, controlled deceleration. The subtle hum of the mechanical cables faded into total silence. A soft melodic chime echoed through the confined space, signaling our arrival at the 40th floor. The heavy brushed steel doors parted down the center and slid open seamlessly. The transition was blinding. We stepped out of the dimly lit cherry wood cabin and directly into the expansive sun-drenched foyer of the primary executive suite. Directly ahead, massive floor-to-ceiling glass walls completely enclosed the central boardroom, offering an unobstructed panoramic view of the entire city skyline. But the breathtaking altitude was not what caused Valerie to freeze in her tracks. The massive mahogany conference table dominating the center of the glass room was not empty. I placed my hand firmly against the small of her back, applying the exact amount of physical pressure required to force her forward. We crossed the threshold together. The final inescapable trap was officially sprung, and she was about to face the devastating consequences of her monstrous greed. I applied precisely calculated pressure to the small of her back to propel her across the threshold. Valerie stumbled forward, her designer heels scraping awkwardly against the polished marble floor. The heavy brushed steel doors of the private executive elevator hissed shut behind us, sealing the room with a definitive airtight lock. We were standing inside the primary boardroom of the Sterling Corporate Tower. The space was designed to intimidate and strip away all illusions of comfort. It was a vast, cavernous expanse of cold steel, dark mahogany, and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a dizzying, unobstructed view of the city 40 stories below. The morning sun poured through the massive windows, casting long, sharp shadows that cut across the pristine floor like prison bars. There was no warmth here, no residential softening to offer her a false sense of security. It was a theater of corporate warfare, engineered specifically to dismantle adversaries before a single word was spoken. Valerie regained her footing and frantically spun around, instinctively reaching for the elevator panel. The biometric scanner remained completely dead to her touch, denying her any chance of retreat. She turned her back to the impenetrable steel doors, her chest heaving as she finally absorbed the absolute scale of her captivity. The sheer magnitude of the room seemed to shrink her down, highlighting the absolute absurdity of her pristine white wedding dress in this sterile, merciless environment. The industrial air conditioning hummed with a low, steady frequency, dropping the ambient temperature to a crisp, clinical chill. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, shivering uncontrollably. The blinding hubris that had fueled her murderous plans for months was rapidly evaporating in the freezing atmosphere of the boardroom. She was entirely isolated, cut off from her syndicate, and trapped in the exact center of my domain. She slowly turned away from the locked elevator doors, her panicked gaze finally sweeping across the massive expanse of the room. The 40-foot mahogany conference table dominating the center of the space was not empty. Sitting perfectly still at the far end, projecting absolute legal authority, was Bradley, my lead corporate counsel. He had the fabricated, nullified deeds stacked neatly in front of him, his hands clasped over the worthless paper she believed held her future. Seated to his right was Gavin, his posture relaxed but radiating the dangerous coiled energy of a tactical operative who had successfully executed a flawless extraction just hours prior. Gavin did not offer a greeting or a change in expression. He simply stared at her with cold, unblinking calculation. But the true terror for Valerie lay beyond my personal team. Standing silently by the expansive glass windows, entirely blocking any fantasy of an escape route, were three individuals radiating undeniable law enforcement authority. Two men wore immaculate conservative dark suits, their lapels adorned with the subtle, unmistakable insignias of the Federal Financial Fraud Division. They were the architects of the global asset freeze that had just bankrupted her offshore syndicate. Standing between them was a hardened homicide detective, a woman with sharp, unforgiving eyes and a thick, highly detailed case file tucked firmly under her arm. Her presence explicitly signaled that this was no longer a simple corporate dispute over stolen property. The investigation into the exhumation of Valerie's first husband had officially breached the boardroom. Valerie stared at the assembly of legal and law enforcement firepower. The staggering reality of the ambush anchored her feet to the marble floor. She had believed she was bringing me here to finalize a flawless theft. Instead, I had delivered her directly to a fully assembled tribunal prepared to dismantle every single criminal mechanism she had spent years carefully building. The overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement briefly short-circuited her brain, but her survival instinct forced a violent reboot. She fell back on the only weapon she had left in her arsenal. She weaponized her fabricated vulnerability. Valerie deliberately dropped her expensive designer purse onto the floor and let out a piercing, hysterical sob. She rushed toward the homicide detective, her face twisted into a flawless mask of absolute manufactured terror. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, her voice shrill and desperate as it echoed off the cold glass walls. She screamed that I had entirely lost my mind. She spun a frantic, breathless narrative claiming I was suffering from a severe, sudden-onset dementia episode. She declared that I had suffered a cardiovascular break that morning, hallucinated a corporate conspiracy, and violently kidnapped her from our wedding ceremony. She begged the federal agents to intervene, demanding they arrest me immediately for illegal detainment and false imprisonment. She clasped her hands together in a theatrical plea for salvation, crying out that she was simply a devoted, terrified bride trying to protect her dying husband from his own degrading mental state. It was a masterful performance fueled by pure, unadulterated desperation. She wept openly, pleading with the fraud investigators to ignore whatever baseless accusations my lawyers had presented, insisting that any financial transfers were legally binding gifts I had authorized. She threw her entire weight into playing the fragile, victimized woman held hostage by an abusive, delusional billionaire. The room remained completely silent. Not a single agent reached for their handcuffs. Bradley did not look up from his documents. Gavin barely blinked. The homicide detective simply watched the theatrical display with an expression of profound clinical disgust. Valerie's screams slowly faded into the chilling, unresponsive void of the boardroom. Her hysterical sobbing hitched in her throat, tapering off into a series of jagged, confused breaths as the profound silence of the room finally registered. The federal agents did not step forward to comfort her. They did not offer her protection or validate her frantic lies. Instead, the homicide detective slowly shifted her gaze away from Valerie and looked deliberately toward the far end of the boardroom. Following the detective's silent cue, a heavy soundproofed oak door built seamlessly into the side wall clicked open. The sound was sharp and mechanical, cutting cleanly through the lingering echo of Valerie's desperate performance. The door swung wide, revealing the adjacent executive antechamber. Two figures stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly into the bright, unyielding sunlight of the main boardroom. It was Thomas and Martha. They looked pale and visibly worn from their time isolated under chemical restraint at the Oakwood sanctuary, but they stood upright, leaning on each other for support. Their eyes were clear-focused and burning with an indestructible, silent fury. They had survived her pharmaceutical prison, and they had arrived to deliver the absolute truth. Valerie froze completely. The manufactured tears dried instantly on her cheeks. The breathless, victimized bride routine evaporated as if she had been struck by lightning. She stared at the elderly couple, her jaw unhinged in sheer, paralyzing horror. These were the ultimate witnesses she had locked away and systematically silenced to protect her murderous history. To her, they were literal ghosts rising from the concrete floor. She stumbled backward, retreating from the undeniable proof of her monstrous cruelty. Her expensive heels tangled and she fell hard against the thick floor-to-ceiling glass wall. She pressed her back against the cold panes, staring at the living evidence of her destruction. The trap had closed entirely, leaving absolutely nowhere left to hide. Valerie remained pinned against the cold glass of the boardroom wall, her hands splayed flat against the transparent surface as if trying to push herself through it and fall 40 stories to the street below. The sight of Thomas and Martha standing before her systematically dismantled every psychological defense she possessed. Her perfectly manufactured victimhood disintegrated into genuine, paralyzing horror. All the blood retreated from her face, leaving her complexion a hollow, ashen gray. She stared at her parents with the wide, unblinking eyes of a woman confronting actual apparitions. In her carefully engineered reality, Thomas and Martha were supposed to be heavily sedated, chemically subdued within the locked walls of room 314 at Oakwood Sanctuary. They were meant to be silent, forgotten collateral damage in her ruthless pursuit of my corporate empire. Yet here they stood, leaning on each other but radiating a terrifying clarity. The lingering physical frailty from months of pharmaceutical abuse was entirely eclipsed by the fiery, unbreakable resolve burning in their eyes. They were not the broken, compliant victims she had left behind. They were survivors who had been shown the absolute depths of their daughter's sociopathy. Valerie's jaw trembled, but her throat constricted, denying her the ability to formulate a single word of justification. Her mind short-circuited as she realized the extraction must have occurred right under her nose, executed with a level of precision she could not even fathom. The federal investigators watched her reaction closely, their expressions hardening as her terrified silence confirmed her guilt louder than any confession. The illusion of the devoted bride was permanently shattered, replaced by the naked, undeniable reality of a cornered predator realizing her prey had outsmarted her at every single turn. Thomas did not offer his daughter a greeting or a shred of parental warmth. He moved away from the side door, walking with slow, deliberate steps toward the center of the room. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded, heavily stamped document. He raised his arm and slammed the paper down onto the center of the massive mahogany table. The sharp smack of paper against wood echoed violently through the silent boardroom. It was the forged medical proxy, the exact legal instrument Valerie had utilized to strip them of their autonomy and lock them away. Thomas kept his hand pressed flat against the document, leaning his weight forward as he locked eyes with the woman he had raised. He spoke in a voice entirely devoid of paternal affection, replacing it with a cold, absolute judgment that cut through the sterile air. He stated with brutal clarity that she had left them to rot in a chemical prison while she danced in designer gowns and plotted another murder. He systematically dismantled her lifelong narrative of entitlement, stating that she had actively stolen their lives, their dignity, and their freedom, purely to protect a fraudulent financial empire. Martha stepped up beside her husband, her posture rigid and unforgiving. She did not yell or cry. She simply stated that the man Valerie had planned to execute was the very man who had shattered their chains and brought them back into the light. Valerie physically shrank under their collective gaze. The supreme authority she had wielded over them had been entirely inverted. Her parents were no longer her hostages or her leverage. They were the key witnesses for the prosecution, fully armed with the unvarnished truth and eager to deliver the fatal blow to her fabricated existence. Cornered by the undeniable presence of her victims, Valerie's survival instinct triggered a frantic, chaotic barrage of deflections. She pushed herself away from the glass wall, her hands gesturing wildly as she launched into a desperate attempt to rewrite reality. She turned her panicked gaze toward the federal fraud investigators, her voice cracking as she began to hurl accusations at phantom accomplices. She screamed that she had absolutely no idea about the abusive conditions at Oakwood Sanctuary. She claimed she was the victim of terrible legal counsel, violently pointing a finger toward the empty air as she blamed the corrupt notary for drafting an overly aggressive proxy without her full comprehension. She shrieked that the facility manager had manipulated her instructions, acting independently to over-medicate her parents to maximize his own profit margins. She spun a frantic, dizzying web of lies, throwing every single person she had ever hired directly under the bus to save her own skin. She pleaded with the homicide detective, insisting that her offshore financial transfers were merely misguided investments recommended by unscrupulous advisors who had taken advantage of her trusting nature. The sheer narcissism of her defense was breathtaking. Confronted with the human beings she had actively tortured, she refused to accept a fraction of accountability. She painted herself as a naive, manipulated woman caught in a conspiracy orchestrated by greedy men. Her shrill voice bounced off the mahogany walls, sounding increasingly unhinged and pathetic. The investigators did not take notes. They did not interject to ask clarifying questions. They simply allowed her to exhaust her lungs, watching the self-destruction of a criminal, incapable of recognizing that her lies possessed absolutely no currency in a room overflowing with empirical evidence. Bradley sat perfectly still at the head of the conference table, his hands resting calmly beside his sleek, open laptop. He allowed Valerie's hysterical tirade to reach its frantic, breathless crescendo before making his move. He did not raise his voice to interrupt her frantic deflections. He simply reached forward and pressed a single button on his keyboard. The boardroom was instantly filled with high-fidelity sound piped directly through the sophisticated overhead acoustic system. It was not a legal deposition or a witness statement. It was a crystal-clear digital audio recording. Valerie's own voice cascaded from the ceiling, dripping with cold, calculating malice. The recording captured her precise instructions regarding the digitalis. The room listened in absolute chilling silence as the digital Valerie cheerfully explained exactly how long it would take for the crushed pills to induce massive cardiac arrest at high altitude. The recording continued, broadcasting her callous laughter as she detailed how she would inherit the entire Sterling Empire before the private jet even touched down on the island tarmac. The live Valerie froze mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open as her own murderous words echoed back at her. The fabricated defense of being a naive, manipulated victim was instantly incinerated by the undeniable sound of her plotting and execution with surgical precision. The homicide detective stepped forward, unbuttoning her suit jacket to reveal the metallic glint of handcuffs resting on her belt. The undeniable proof of premeditated murder hung heavy in the cold, air-conditioned space. The meticulously constructed illusion of the devoted, grieving bride had been entirely dismantled, replaced by the documented reality of a lethal corporate predator. Her own voice had delivered the absolute, inescapable verdict. The metallic clink of the detective's handcuffs shattered the final remnants of Valerie's paralyzing shock. The sheer proximity of a prison sentence triggered a violent, desperate pivot in her survival strategy. She violently shoved herself away from the glass wall, ignoring the piercing glares of her parents. She squared her shoulders, attempting to reconstruct the arrogant posture of a billionaire's wife. If her criminal immunity was gone, she would brutally enforce her financial entitlement. She pointed a manicured finger at the mahogany table, her voice trembling but laced with absolute defiance. She declared that the audio recording was an illegally obtained fabrication and entirely inadmissible in any legitimate court. She aggressively shifted the battlefield from homicide to corporate law. She loudly proclaimed that she was legally recognized as my spouse and the sole beneficiary of the Sterling Empire. She demanded immediate, unhindered access to her property, citing the ironclad prenuptial agreement and the accelerated asset transfer documents we had finalized just days prior. She screamed that a piece of paper signed in ink outranked a heavily edited audio file. She commanded the federal agents to back away, asserting that no law enforcement body possessed the jurisdiction to interfere with a private, legally binding marital contract. She was attempting to build a fortress out of fraudulent paperwork, clinging desperately to the delusion that her stolen wealth would somehow shield her from a murder charge. She glared directly at me, demanding that I instruct my legal counsel to honor the transfer. She insisted the estate was already legally fractured and fully absorbed into her private holdings. She stood her ground, demanding her stolen crown. Bradley did not exhibit a single flinch of intimidation in the face of her shrieking demands. He remained seated at the head of the conference table, his demeanor reflecting the cold, precise machinery of an apex corporate litigator. He calmly opened his black leather portfolio and retrieved a thick stack of heavily embossed legal documents. It was the exact accelerated asset transfer Valerie had forced upon me at the estate, the very paperwork she believed guaranteed her absolute ownership of my wealth. Bradley placed his hand flat on the top page and slid it smoothly across the polished mahogany surface. The heavy paper coasted to a halt mere inches from Valerie's trembling hands. He retrieved a silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and tapped the metallic tip sharply against the primary signature line at the bottom of the page. He instructed her to examine the ink carefully. Valerie looked down, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the cursive loops of my signature. Bradley did not wait for her to process the flaw. He ruthlessly articulated the trap. He explained that I had been entirely aware of her lethal intentions the exact moment she placed the document on my desk. He pointed out the deliberate microscopic alteration in the signature. A heavily modified middle initial and a distinctly misspelled surname effectively rendered the entire authorization completely void. I had never signed my actual legal name. Bradley stated with absolute crushing finality that the contract was a meaningless piece of scrap paper. It possessed absolutely no legal weight. The transfer was never initiated. She had spent months plotting an elaborate execution for an inheritance that had never legally existed. The fraudulent paper fortress she had just attempted to hide behind collapsed into dust. The sudden realization of her absolute financial impotence struck Valerie like a physical blow. Before she could drag air back into her lungs to formulate another lie, the two federal fraud investigators stepped away from the panoramic windows. They moved in perfect synchronization, flanking Bradley at the mahogany table. The lead agent, a tall man with a voice like grinding granite, addressed her directly. He announced that the voided asset transfer was merely the opening mechanism of my defensive strategy. He informed her that the offshore routing numbers she had so eagerly provided to facilitate the massive wealth extraction were not anonymous channels. They were a highly monitored, fully exposed digital pipeline engineered jointly by my cybersecurity division and federal financial regulators. The agent explained the brutal mechanics of her downfall. The exact moment her corrupt associates attempted to wire the initial test sums into those specific offshore accounts, they triggered a massive automated federal tripwire, The investigators had mapped every single shadow account, shell corporation, and illicit trust fund Valerie possessed across the globe. He declared that a coordinated international asset freeze had been executed precisely 20 minutes before she stepped into the corporate elevator. Every single cent she had hoarded, stolen, or hidden throughout her entire criminal career was officially seized by the federal government under racketeering and wire fraud statutes. The luxurious safety nets she had relied upon to fund her legal defense and secure her escapes were entirely eradicated. She did not possess a single liquid asset. Her bank accounts were locked, her properties were seized, and her endless greed had served as the precise instrument of her total devastating financial ruin. Valerie stared at the federal agents, her eyes wide and completely hollow. The immense, sprawling empire of stolen wealth she had meticulously built over a decade had been vaporized in a matter of seconds. The second fraud investigator leaned forward, resting his knuckles against the polished wood of the table, ensuring she felt the absolute crushing weight of her isolation. He systematically severed her final remaining lifelines. He announced that the tactical raid on her offshore accounts was only one fraction of the morning's coordinated strike. He informed her that the fraudulent notary she had routinely utilized to forge the medical proxies, the same man who had illegally authorized the seizure of her parents' estate, had been apprehended by a tactical unit exactly 1 hour ago. He was currently sitting in an interrogation room, actively surrendering her name to secure a federal plea deal. The agent did not stop there. He detailed the swift, aggressive apprehension of the 3 corrupt real estate buyers who had actively colluded with her to liquidate her previous victims' assets. They were all in federal custody, entirely stripped of their leverage and aggressively turning state's evidence against her to avoid maximum sentencing. Her entire criminal syndicate had collapsed simultaneously. There were no fixers left to call, no corrupt officials left to bribe, and absolutely no shadows left to hide within. She was completely bankrupt, entirely exposed, and fundamentally alone. The homicide detective stepped around the mahogany table, the steel handcuffs clinking sharply against her belt as she closed the final physical distance. Valerie backed up against the reinforced glass wall once more, completely boxed in by the ghosts of her past and the inescapable reality of her immediate future. The homicide detective stepped around the edge of the mahogany conference table, her presence commanding the immediate, undivided attention of every single person in the room. She moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of an apex predator that had successfully cornered its prey and was in no rush to deliver the final fatal strike. The metallic clink of her handcuffs had already shattered Valerie's delusions of a corporate escape, but the detective was not finished dismantling her life. She reached beneath her tailored suit jacket and retrieved a thick, heavily bound manila folder, its edges worn from weeks of intense covert handling. The entire boardroom held its collective breath as she raised the dense file high above the polished wood surface. She let it drop. The heavy stack of documents struck the mahogany table with a sharp, resonant thud that echoed like a cannon blast against the panoramic glass walls. The sound demanded absolute submission. A thick, suffocating silence instantly descended upon the room, heavy enough to crush the oxygen from the air. The low, steady hum of the industrial air conditioning seemed to vanish entirely. Valerie stared at the manila folder as if it were a live, explosive device ticking down to zero. Her eyes darted frantically from the thick stack of sealed papers to the impassive, hardened face of the veteran detective. The last lingering traces of her manufactured outrage evaporated, replaced immediately by a primal, sinking terror. She knew exactly what kind of documentation a homicide investigator carried in a file of that specific magnitude. The corporate fraud and the voided asset transfers were catastrophic, but they were merely financial penalties. The folder resting on the table represented the absolute end of her freedom. The detective placed her hands flat against the mahogany, leaning her weight forward to lock eyes with the trembling woman backed against the glass. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with a quiet, lethal clarity that paralyzed Valerie completely. The detective introduced herself formally for the official record, detailing her specific jurisdiction over the Regional Cold Case and Major Crimes Division. She stated that for the past 6 weeks, her department had been quietly conducting a comprehensive covert investigation into the sudden and highly suspicious death of Arthur Pendleton, Valerie's first husband. Valerie flinched violently as if she had been physically struck across the face by the mere mention of his name. The detective explained that the initial ruling of a natural heart attack had always possessed alarming documented inconsistencies, primarily due to Valerie's aggressive insistence on a rapid burial and her immediate ruthless liquidation of his estate. The detective outlined how my private security team had provided the initial anonymous tip, handing over a meticulously documented dossier detailing Valerie's pharmaceutical purchasing habits and her suspiciously familiar methods of operation. This undeniable evidence had provided the exact legal leverage required to petition a federal judge for a highly restricted exhumation order. The detective leaned closer, her unwavering gaze pinning Valerie to the glass wall. She announced that the physical extraction of Arthur's casket had been executed in absolute secrecy 3 days prior, deliberately conducted under the cover of a severe midnight storm to prevent any local media interference or premature leaks. She detailed how the remains were immediately transported under armed guard to a secure federal laboratory for a comprehensive forensic analysis. She paused, letting the immense gravity of the situation fully saturate the freezing air of the boardroom. She then stated with brutal, uncompromising finality that the extensive autopsy and the subsequent specialized tissue analysis had been officially completed at exactly 4 o'clock this morning. Valerie stopped breathing entirely. The invisible walls of her carefully constructed criminal history were collapsing inward, trapping her within the exact nightmare she had spent a decade outrunning. The dark secrets she thought she had buried deep underground were now resting right on top of the conference table. The detective reached forward and flipped open the heavy cardboard cover of the manila folder. She bypassed the preliminary investigative reports and went straight for the primary toxicology results, pulling out a single stark sheet of paper stamped with the official raised seal of the Federal Medical Examiner. She held the document up so the harsh morning sunlight illuminated the dense blocks of complex medical data. She read the findings aloud, her voice completely devoid of any sympathy, hesitation, or warmth. She stated that despite the passage of several years, modern forensic pathology possessed the advanced capability to detect highly specific chemical signatures embedded deep within preserved muscle tissue and bone marrow. She announced that the federal laboratory had conducted targeted mass spectrometry, specifically searching for anomalies in Arthur's degraded cardiovascular system. The results were absolutely indisputable and scientifically flawless. The medical examiner had isolated massive concentrated traces of digoxin, the active and highly lethal compound found within digitalis. The detective explained that the concentration of the toxin was so extraordinarily high that it entirely ruled out any statistical possibility of accidental ingestion or a natural medical event. She outlined how the specific chemical profile perfectly matched the exact pharmaceutical compounds Valerie had been actively slipping into my coffee over the past 3 months. The methodology was identical. The lethal dosage was identical. The malicious intention was identical. The detective lowered the paper and placed it squarely on top of the open file for everyone to see. She stated that the original death certificate had been officially revoked by the state medical board exactly 1 hour ago. The manner of Arthur's death had been formally reclassified from natural causes to premeditated first-degree homicide. There was no ambiguity left to exploit. There were no loopholes remaining in the legal system. Valerie was officially the primary and solitary suspect in a confirmed capital murder investigation. The devastating reality of the medical examiner's report struck Valerie with the unrestrained force of a wrecking ball. The arrogant, untouchable corporate predator was instantly annihilated, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a hollow, terrified shell of a human being. Her knees buckled violently under the crushing, undeniable weight of a guaranteed life sentence. She collapsed straight down onto the polished marble floor, her expensive white wedding dress pooling around her in a pathetic, ruined heap of imported silk and lace. She did not even attempt to stand back up. She completely abandoned all remaining remnants of her dignity, crawling forward on her hands and knees like a shattered animal until she reached the edge of my tailored suit. She reached out with trembling, frantic hands, clutching desperately at the fabric of my trousers. She threw her head back, exposing a face completely stained with genuine terrified tears and ruined makeup. Her voice was unrecognizable, reduced to a hoarse, guttural shriek as she begged for a mercy she had never once shown to any of her victims. She pleaded with me to make the federal agents leave, to use my immense wealth and influence to bury the autopsy report, to somehow magically rewrite the reality of her incoming imprisonment. She promised absolute, unwavering obedience, crying out that she would surrender every single stolen asset and walk away with absolutely nothing if I just gave her one more chance to disappear. She swore she could change, sobbing uncontrollably against my shoes, completely disregarding the cold, unforgiving stares of her parents and the heavily armed law enforcement officers surrounding her. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman, desperately clinging to my legs. I did not move to comfort her. I did not pull away. I simply watched the absolute destruction of her monumental ego, feeling nothing but a profound, icy satisfaction. The executioner had officially become the condemned. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman, desperately clinging to my legs. The fabric of my trousers absorbed her tears, but I felt absolutely nothing. There was no residual affection, no lingering trace of the love I had once genuinely offered her. There was not even the hot, blinding flash of anger that usually accompanies a betrayal of this massive magnitude. I felt absolute zero. I experienced the precise, calculated detachment of a structural engineer watching a condemned building collapse exactly according to the demolition blueprints. Valerie had spent months treating me like a fragile, dying animal, waiting patiently for my heart to fail so she could harvest my life's work. She had systematically dismantled my reality, isolating me from my corporate allies and feeding me poison under the guise of wifely devotion. Now the architecture of her own malicious design was imploding directly on top of her. I watched her shoulders heave as she sobbed against the cold floor. I observed the frantic, pathetic way she attempted to leverage her physical vulnerability to manipulate the room. She was attempting to use the very same tears she had shed over my supposedly failing health, the same manufactured empathy she had weaponized to secure my forged signatures. It was a pathetic display of a predator stripped of its fangs, relying on a deeply ingrained habit of deception that had suddenly lost all its functional currency. The federal agents watched her with clinical disgust, entirely immune to her performance. I simply stood my ground like a monument of cold stone. I did not offer her a single syllable of comfort. I did not bend to pull her up from the polished marble floor. I allowed her to grovel in the ruins of her own catastrophic ambition. The homicide detective stepped around the edge of the mahogany table with the heavy, measured strides of an executioner ascending the scaffold. She did not issue a verbal warning or offer a sympathetic platitude. She moved with ruthless mechanical efficiency, reaching down to grab Valerie roughly by the upper arm. The detective hauled the sobbing bride up from the marble floor, forcing her to stand on her trembling legs. Valerie thrashed weakly against the detective's iron grip, her expensive white silk wedding dress twisting and tearing as she desperately tried to pull away from the inevitable reality of her arrest. The detective swiftly spun Valerie around, pinning her arms forcefully behind her back. The bright morning sunlight caught the dull metallic sheen of the steel handcuffs as the detective unclipped them from her tactical belt. She clamped the first heavy steel ring tightly around Valerie's right wrist. The sharp metallic click echoed through the cavernous, glass-walled boardroom like a gunshot. It was a deafening, definitive sound of absolute finality. The detective secured the left wrist, snapping the second lock into place with a brutal mechanical precision that severed Valerie completely from her former life of untouchable luxury. The cold steel bit deeply into her skin, a physical manifestation of the permanent chains she had forged for herself. The fraud investigators stepped forward, closing the perimeter around the prisoner. The lead agent formally recited the Miranda warning, his deep voice carrying the crushing weight of federal prosecution. He listed the staggering array of charges encompassing first-degree attempted murder, grand corporate larceny, wire fraud, and the unlawful imprisonment of her own parents. The heavy syllables of the criminal code filled the room, replacing the vows of matrimony she had intended to falsely swear that very morning. The handcuffs secured her destiny completely. The cold, unyielding bite of the steel handcuffs finally penetrated the hysterical fog of Valerie's manufactured victimhood. The realization that her tears possessed absolutely no leverage in this boardroom struck her with violent, undeniable clarity. The pathetic, weeping bride instantly vanished. The flawless, socially acceptable mask she had worn for a decade shattered into a million jagged pieces, exposing the raw, venomous monster lurking underneath. She stopped sobbing abruptly. She planted her designer heels firmly against the polished marble floor, physically resisting the detective's push toward the exit. She whipped her head around to glare at me, her eyes burning with a sudden feral hatred. Her beautiful features twisted into a grotesque, snarling grimace. She unleashed a torrential barrage of vile, screaming obscenities that echoed violently against the panoramic windows. She cursed my name, spitting pure venom as she detailed her absolute disgust for the life we had shared. She screamed that I deserved to die slowly, boasting loudly about the sheer pleasure she had experienced while feeding me poison disguised as daily medication. She hurled vicious insults at her own parents, glaring at Thomas and Martha with unvarnished malice, screaming that they were useless artifacts who should have rotted quietly in the facility she had chosen for them. The sheer volume and intensity of her hatred shocked the air in the room. She thrashed wildly against the federal agents, snapping her teeth and kicking out with her heels like a cornered rabid animal. The sophisticated, elegant woman who had graced high society galas was completely obliterated. The investigators grabbed her firmly by the shoulders, forcefully dragging her backwards toward the waiting elevator. She continued to scream her venomous curses, her monstrous true nature fully illuminated by the morning sun as they hauled her across the threshold and out of my corporate sanctuary. The heavy brushed steel doors of the private executive elevator hissed shut abruptly, cutting off Valerie's feral screams. The sudden silence that fell over the primary boardroom was profound and absolute. The toxic energy she had brought into the space was instantly neutralized, leaving behind the sterile, controlled atmosphere of my corporate domain. I did not watch the digital floor indicator tick downward. I turned my back to the elevator doors, completely dismissing her existence from my reality. She was no longer a threat to my empire or my life. She was merely a logistical problem that the federal justice system would now process, categorize, and discard. I slowly walked back toward the center of the room, my footsteps echoing rhythmically across the marble floor. I approached Thomas and Martha. The elderly couple stood close together near the mahogany table, their hands tightly clasped. They watched me with a mixture of residual shock and profound unspoken gratitude. They had witnessed the absolute destruction of their tormentor, and the heavy chains of their psychological captivity were permanently shattered. I stopped directly in front of them, my posture softening slightly to acknowledge their immense suffering and endurance. I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved a pristine, unsealed legal envelope. I held it out toward Thomas. I spoke in a quiet, highly respectful tone, informing him that the contents contained the complete, unredacted documentation of their immediate emancipation and total financial restoration. I explicitly told them to review the primary affidavits carefully. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman desperately clinging to my legs. The fabric of my trousers absorbed her tears, but I felt absolutely nothing. There was no residual affection, no lingering trace of the love I had once genuinely offered her. There was not even the hot, blinding flash of anger that usually accompanies a betrayal of this massive magnitude. I felt absolute zero. I experienced the precise, calculated detachment of a structural engineer watching a condemned building collapse exactly according to the demolition blueprints. Valerie had spent months treating me like a fragile, dying animal, waiting patiently for my heart to fail so she could harvest my life's work. She had systematically dismantled my reality, isolating me from my corporate allies and feeding me poison under the guise of wifely devotion. Now the architecture of her own malicious design was imploding directly on top of her. I watched her shoulders heave as she sobbed against the cold floor. I observed the frantic, pathetic way she attempted to leverage her physical vulnerability to manipulate the room. She was attempting to use the very same tears she had shed over my supposedly failing health, the same manufactured empathy she had weaponized to secure my forged signatures. It was a pathetic display of a predator stripped of its fangs, relying on a deeply ingrained habit of deception that had suddenly lost all its functional currency. The federal agents watched her with clinical disgust, entirely immune to her performance. I simply stood my ground, like a monument of cold stone. I did not offer her a single syllable of comfort. I did not bend to pull her up from the polished marble floor. I allowed her to grovel in the ruins of her own catastrophic ambition. The homicide detective stepped around the edge of the mahogany table with the heavy measured strides of an executioner ascending the scaffold. She did not issue a verbal warning or offer a sympathetic platitude. She moved with ruthless mechanical efficiency, reaching down to grab Valerie roughly by the upper arm. The detective hauled the sobbing bride up from the marble floor, forcing her to stand on her trembling legs. Valerie thrashed weakly against the detective's iron grip, her expensive white silk wedding dress twisting and tearing as she desperately tried to pull away from the inevitable reality of her arrest. The detective swiftly spun Valerie around, pinning her arms forcefully behind her back. The bright morning sunlight caught the dull metallic sheen of the steel handcuffs as the detective unclipped them from her tactical belt. She clamped the first heavy steel ring tightly around Valerie's right wrist. The sharp metallic click echoed through the cavernous, glass-walled boardroom like a gunshot. It was a deafening, definitive sound of absolute finality. The detective secured the left wrist, snapping the second lock into place with a brutal mechanical precision that severed Valerie completely from her former life of untouchable luxury. The cold steel bit deeply into her skin, a physical manifestation of the permanent chains she had forged for herself. The fraud investigator stepped forward, closing the perimeter around the prisoner. The lead agent formally recited the Miranda warning, his deep voice carrying the crushing weight of federal prosecution. He listed the staggering array of charges encompassing first-degree attempted murder, grand corporate larceny, wire fraud, and the unlawful imprisonment of her own parents. The heavy syllables of the criminal code filled the room, replacing the vows of matrimony she had intended to falsely swear that very morning. The handcuffs secured her destiny completely. The cold, unyielding bite of the steel handcuffs finally penetrated the hysterical fog of Valerie's manufactured victimhood. The realization that her tears possessed absolutely no leverage in this boardroom struck her with violent, undeniable clarity. The pathetic weeping bride instantly vanished. The flawless, socially acceptable mask she had worn for a decade shattered into a million jagged pieces, exposing the raw, venomous monster lurking underneath. She stopped sobbing abruptly. She planted her designer heels firmly against the polished marble floor, physically resisting the detective's push toward the exit. She whipped her head around to glare at me, her eyes burning with a sudden feral hatred. Her beautiful features twisted into a grotesque, snarling grimace. She unleashed a torrential barrage of vile, screaming obscenities that echoed violently against the panoramic windows. She cursed my name, spitting pure venom as she detailed her absolute disgust for the life we had shared. She screamed that I deserved to die slowly, boasting loudly about the sheer pleasure she had experienced while feeding me poison disguised as daily medication. She hurled vicious insults at her own parents, glaring at Thomas and Martha with unvarnished malice, screaming that they were useless artifacts who should have rotted quietly in the facility she had chosen for them. The sheer volume and intensity of her hatred shocked the air in the room. She thrashed wildly against the federal agents, snapping her teeth and kicking out with her heels like a cornered rabid animal. The sophisticated, elegant woman who had graced high society galas was completely obliterated. The investigators grabbed her firmly by the shoulders, forcefully dragging her backwards toward the waiting elevator. She continued to scream her venomous curses, her monstrous true nature fully illuminated by the morning sun as they hauled her across the threshold and out of my corporate sanctuary. The heavy brushed steel doors of the private executive elevator hissed shut, abruptly cutting off Valerie's feral screams. The sudden silence that fell over the primary boardroom was profound and absolute. The toxic energy she had brought into the space was instantly neutralized, leaving behind the sterile, controlled atmosphere of my corporate domain. I did not watch the digital floor indicator tick downward. I turned my back to the elevator doors, completely dismissing her existence from my reality. She was no longer a threat to my empire or my life. She was merely a logistical problem that the federal justice system would now process, categorize, and discard. I slowly walked back toward the center of the room, my footsteps echoing rhythmically across the marble floor. I approached Thomas and Martha. The elderly couple stood close together near the mahogany table, their hands tightly clasped. They watched me with a mixture of residual shock and profound unspoken gratitude. They had witnessed the absolute destruction of their tormentor, and the heavy chains of their psychological captivity were permanently shattered. I stopped directly in front of them, my posture softening slightly to acknowledge their immense suffering and endurance. I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved a pristine, unsealed legal envelope. I held it out toward Thomas. I spoke in a quiet, highly respectful tone, informing him that the contents contained the complete, unredacted documentation of their immediate emancipation and total financial restoration. I explicitly told them to review the primary affidavits carefully. Truthfully, true power does not announce its presence through loud threats or chaotic aggression. It resides in the quiet, meticulous observation of your surroundings. When malicious individuals mistake patience for weakness, they unwittingly construct their own inevitable downfall. Trust must be earned through consistent integrity, not merely demanded through proximity or obligation. It is essential to protect your legacy and health against those who wear masks of affection to conceal profound greed. Ultimately, maintaining a calm, disciplined mind in the face of deep betrayal allows you to strike with absolute precision, turning their blinding arrogance into a permanent prison cage. What did you think of Lawrence's masterfully executed revenge? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below and do not forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling stories.